They say the most dangerous animal in the woods is a wounded one. My husband and his mother were about to find out they had just locked a wounded wolf out in the freezing rain. The brass deadbolt echoed through the heavy oak door with a sharp and definitive clack. I stood on the porch of the Portland home I had poured my heart into, while the icy coastal Maine rain soaked through my wool coat. The wind howled off the jagged coastline, carrying the bitter scent of brine and broken pine branches. I shivered with my numb fingers gripping the handle of a single rolling suitcase. My mind struggled to process the paradox of my reality. Less than 24 hours ago, I had officially inherited $6 million. Yet here I was, standing in the freezing dark, locked out of my own life. Before I tell you how my own family orchestrated this nightmare, I have a quick question for you. How old are you while you are listening to this? Drop your age in the comments below, and welcome back to Sarah Told Stories. To understand how a woman inherits an empire only to end up on the wrong side of a locked door, you have to rewind to the previous afternoon. The air in California had been dry and warm, a stark contrast to the rugged northeast weather I was accustomed to. I sat in a sterile glass-walled conference room overlooking the Pacific, wearing a black dress that still smelled faintly of the funeral parlor. Across the mahogany table sat my late father's estate attorney. My father was a force of nature. While I had chosen a life knee-deep in tidal pools and rehabilitation enclosures as a coastal wildlife director, he had built a quiet fortune in real estate. We were different, but we understood each other. He taught me how to read the tides, how to untangle a knotted lobster trap, and how to stand my ground when the wind shifted. "Stephanie, your father's directives are clear," the attorney said, his voice gentle but formal. "The liquid assets, along with the Lake Tahoe mansion, are left to you. $6 million, a sprawling estate in the Sierra Nevadas." The numbers felt abstract, hollowed out by the raw ache of his absence. Wealth could not buy back the man who used to carry me on his shoulders through the dense pine forests of my childhood. I signed the necessary documents, thanked the lawyer, and booked the first flight back to Maine. I just wanted to go home. I wanted the familiar smell of sea salt and cedar. More than anything, I wanted the comforting embrace of Derek, my husband of 10 years. Derek was a successful real estate broker, polished, charismatic, and always dressed in tailored suits that seemed impervious to the rugged elements of our state. Lately, a growing distance had crept between us. Late nights at the office, hushed phone calls, a lingering tension over morning coffee. But I had chalked it up to the stress of his demanding market. Grief makes you crave anchors, and I was desperate for mine. When I finally turned my key in the lock of our Portland home, the familiar warmth of the foyer greeted me. But the silence inside felt heavy, stretched tight like a fishing line about to snap. Derek stood near the entryway console. He wore a crisp navy blazer and slacks, looking less like a grieving husband and more like a man preparing for a hostile boardroom negotiation. "Derek," I breathed, dropping my travel bag. I stepped forward, expecting him to close the distance. He did not move. His jaw was set, his eyes devoid of the warmth I had relied on for a decade. Instead of opening his arms, he reached onto the console and picked up a thick manila envelope. He extended it toward me, his arm stiff. "What is this?" I asked, my voice faltering. "It is for the best," he replied, his tone chillingly level. My hands trembled as I took the envelope. The paper felt unusually heavy. I slid my thumb under the flap and pulled out the crisp white documents. The bold, capitalized header at the top of the first page seemed to blur before focusing into a singular, devastating word. Petition. Divorce papers. The air vanished from the room. My mind raced, frantically searching for a missed warning sign, a catalyst for this sudden ambush. Then a seemingly insignificant memory surfaced, clicking into place with horrifying clarity. Lauren. She was a junior title agent at Derek's brokerage. A month ago, she had shown up at our front door unannounced, holding a leather folio claiming she needed Derek's signature on routine closing paperwork. I remembered the cloying scent of her expensive perfume. I remembered her lingering in the foyer, her eyes darting across the architectural details of my home. She had reached out, tracing her manicured fingers along the custom crown molding my father had helped me install. Beautiful craftsmanship. She had purred her gaze, calculating, almost possessive. Before I could voice the realization forming in my throat, the sharp click of heels sounded on the hardwood floor. Patricia stepped out of the kitchen. Derek's mother was 62, a woman who treated Maine's high society like her personal kingdom. She wore a pristine cashmere sweater, a crystal glass of iced tea resting in her manicured hand. Patricia had never hidden her disdain for my career. To her, a woman who spent her days rescuing injured seals and wearing rubber boots was an embarrassment to her son's polished image. She stopped beside Derek, her posture radiating triumphant authority. A cold, satisfied smirk played on her lips. "Do not bother unpacking," Patricia stated, her voice smooth and venomous. "The house is already sold. You are out by the weekend." I stared at her, the divorce papers crumpling slightly in my grip. "Sold? That is impossible. My name is on the deed." "Derek is a very resourceful broker," Patricia replied, taking a slow sip of her tea. "You should have paid closer attention to what you were signing." As she lowered her glass, the soft glow of the foyer chandelier caught the jewelry resting against her cashmere collar. My breath hitched. It was a vintage pearl necklace. The pearls themselves were rare, iridescent, and perfectly matched. But it was the clasp that made my blood run cold. A heavy, custom gold clasp shaped like a laurel wreath. It was my mother's necklace. I had kept it secured in a velvet box inside my locked cedar vanity upstairs. My mother had worn it on her wedding day. Patricia was not just wearing stolen jewelry. She was wearing it as a trophy, a deliberate, cruel signal that my sanctuary had been pillaged while I was burying my father. This was no spontaneous breakup. This was a calculated, orchestrated heist. They had waited until I was out of state, consumed by grief, to spring the trap. I looked from the stolen pearls on Patricia's neck to the icy detachment in Derek's eyes. The man I had loved was gone, replaced by a stranger counting a payout. The battle lines were drawn, the door had locked behind me, leaving me on the freezing porch. But as the icy rain battered my face, the initial shock began to recede, replaced by a quiet, burning clarity. The rain turned to sleet by the time I reached a roadside motel 2 towns over. My clothes clung to my skin like a layer of ice. I paid for a single night, with a crumpled bill I found stuffed inside my coat pocket, sliding the heavy metal key across the scratched laminate counter. Room 12 sat at the far end of the lot, beneath a flickering neon sign that cast a sickly red glow through the thin curtains. I dropped my suitcase onto the faded carpet and sat on the edge of the stiff mattress. The heater in the corner rattled, pushing out lukewarm air that smelled of dust and old tobacco. I uncurled my stiff fingers. Resting in my palm was my father's brass compass. It was heavy and cold, the engraved coordinates on the back worn smooth from years of him rubbing his thumb across the metal. He gave it to me when I was a teenager, teaching me how to navigate the dense pine forests of northern Maine. He used to say, "The world will always try to turn you around, but true north never moves." I tipped the brass casing, watching the needle spin wildly before finally settling. I needed true north more than ever. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the stolen pearls resting against Patricia's cashmere sweater. I saw the calculated emptiness in my husband's stare. 10 years of shared coffee, 10 years of inside jokes and quiet moments by the fireplace, erased in a single, ruthless stroke. They had planned this for months, studying my vulnerabilities, waiting for the exact moment my father died to pull the rug out from under my feet. But grief is a strange fuel. The initial shock was already hardening into something cold and sharp. I did not cry. Crying was for victims, and I refused to play that part. Dawn broke, gray and unforgiving. I splashed freezing water on my face, changed into a dry sweater from my suitcase, and drove straight to my local bank branch. The plan was simple. I needed to withdraw emergency funds from the joint savings account I shared with Derek. I needed enough cash to secure Jonathan Reed, my late father's estate attorney. Jonathan was a legend in New England legal circles, a stoic, brilliant tactician who treated the law like a high-stakes chessboard. The warmth inside the bank lobby offered a sharp contrast to the bitter wind outside. I took a seat across from a branch manager named Mr. Davis, a man who had known Derek and me for years. He offered a polite smile that quickly faded as he pulled up my profile on his monitor. The rhythmic clacking of his keyboard slowed. His brow furrowed. He clicked his mouse several times, his posture stiffening. "Mrs. Hudson," he began, his voice dropping to a low, uncomfortable whisper. "Was there a recent major transaction you authorized for the real estate firm?" My stomach plummeted. I shook my head, gripping the armrests of the leather chair. "I have not authorized anything. I just need to withdraw $10,000 for a legal retainer." Mr. Davis turned the monitor slightly toward me. The numbers on the screen blurred before snapping into agonizing focus. The joint checking account read 0. The savings account, which we had spent a decade building, read 0. Derek had swept every single penny out of our shared finances the day before I returned from California. "He took it all," I whispered, the betrayal twisting like a knife in my ribs. But Mr. Davis was not finished. His eyes darted nervously around the lobby before he leaned in closer. "It is not just the personal account, Stephanie. You have 3 new commercial lines of credit opened in the last 14 days. They are drawn against the Coastal Wildlife Center." The air rushed out of my lungs. I snatched the printed statement from his hands, my eyes scanning the relentless columns of debt. $50,000. Then another $80,000, then a final draw of $120,000. All of it secured by the physical property of my nonprofit. The rehabilitation enclosures, the medical equipment, the marine transport vehicles. My entire life's work was now drowning in debt. "Who authorized this?" I demanded, my voice trembling with a rage I had never felt before. He tapped a line on the second page. "You did. Your signature is on the guarantor documents along with a notary stamp from your husband's brokerage firm." I stared at the black ink looping across the bottom of the page. It looked exactly like my signature. But I had been in California sitting by a hospital bed while this paperwork was filed. Derek did not just take my money. He had fraudulently shackled my wildlife sanctuary to his own secretive debts. If these loans defaulted, the bank would seize my nonprofit. He was holding the animals, the staff, and my professional reputation hostage. I was a millionaire on paper thanks to my father's will. But standing in that bank lobby, I was penniless and facing catastrophic ruin. The walls of the bank felt like they were closing in. I thanked Mr. Davis, gathered the fraudulent statements, and walked back out into the freezing wind. I climbed into the driver's seat of my car and gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Derek had weaponized my signature. He and Patricia thought this would break me. They thought tying a cinder block to my ankles would force me to sink to the bottom of the ocean without a fight. I pulled out my phone and dialed the only person I trusted. Megan was the head veterinary tech at my wildlife center, a fierce, loyal friend who had stood by me through countless coastal storms. When she answered, I swallowed my pride. I explained the lockout, the drained accounts, and the urgent need for a lawyer. I did not even have to finish the sentence. Within 10 minutes, Megan wired $5,000 of her own savings into a newly opened solo checking account under my maiden name. An hour later, I sat in the downtown Portland office of Jonathan Reed. The room smelled of old paper, polished leather, and sharp espresso. Jonathan sat behind a heavy mahogany desk, reviewing the bank printouts I had handed him. He did not offer empty sympathy. He did not give me a pitying look. He read every line of the fraudulent loan documents with the cold precision of a surgeon finding a tumor. "This notary stamp," he said, tapping a silver pen against the paperwork. "It belongs to a junior title agent." "I know," I replied, my voice steady. "Her name is Lauren. She works for my husband. She was at my house a month ago, surveying the property." Jonathan leaned back, interlacing his fingers. He looked at me with piercing gray eyes. "Your husband and his mother have engineered a hostile takeover of your life, Stephanie. They assume you will act predictably. They expect you to show up at the house screaming. They expect you to call the police to beg for your clothes, to threaten them with lawyers over the phone. They want a reaction because a reaction gives them leverage." "So what do I do?" I asked, leaning forward. Jonathan set the pen down. "Nothing." I blinked, staring at him. "Nothing. They forged my signature and stole my home. You give them total silence," he instructed, his voice dropping to a low, steady cadence. "You do not text Derek. You do not call Patricia. You let them sit in the house they stole and wait for a storm that does not arrive. Silence is the one weapon they cannot control. People who commit fraud live in a state of constant paranoia. When you do not react, their paranoia will fester. They will start making reckless, undocumented mistakes. We need them to feel victorious, because arrogant people are careless people." I looked down at the brass compass resting in my lap. My thumb traced the coordinates on the back. The thought of letting Patricia sit in my living room wearing my mother's pearls made my blood boil. The thought of Derek using my wildlife center as a piggy bank made me want to tear his tailored suits to shreds. But Jonathan was right. A wounded wolf does not howl to let the hunters know where she is hiding. She waits in the shadows, watching the hunters separate, studying their weaknesses until it is time to strike. I looked back up at Jonathan and nodded slowly. "Okay. We play dead." Jonathan offered a grim, thin smile. "Good, because while they are busy celebrating their victory, I am going to start digging into this real estate firm. If your husband is desperate enough to forge commercial loans, he is hiding a secret far bigger than a divorce." I left his office with a singular, focused mission. I would return to my wildlife center and act as though the world was perfectly normal. I would let them think they had won. But as I drove back toward the coast, my phone buzzed on the passenger seat. It was a text from Megan, containing a screenshot of a local Maine society blog. Patricia was not just sitting quietly in my stolen house. She was already making her next move, and she was coming for the one thing I still had left: my reputation. The smell of iodine and frozen sea spray usually brought me peace. Walking into my coastal wildlife center the next morning, I tried to let the familiar routine anchor my racing heart. I checked the filtration tanks. I fed a harbor seal pup recovering from a propeller strike. I acted as though my entire world had not just been stolen out from under me. Megan watched me from the reception desk with quiet concern, but she knew better than to push. We had work to do, and animals that depended on us. But the illusion of normalcy shattered before 10 o'clock. The main office phone rang. Megan answered, her bright, professional tone shifting almost instantly into a tight, nervous hum. She placed her hand over the receiver and looked at me, her eyes wide. "It is Eleanor," she whispered. Eleanor was our primary benefactor, a retired shipping heiress whose annual grants kept our rehabilitation enclosures running through the harsh Maine winters. I took the receiver, wiping my damp hands on my canvas trousers. Good morning, Eleanor, I said, forcing a warm, steady tone. There was a long, uncomfortable pause on the line, the kind of silence that precedes a firing squad. Stephanie, I will keep this brief, Eleanor began, her voice devoid of its usual grandmotherly warmth. The foundation board had an emergency meeting this morning. We are suspending your winter grant effective immediately. My lungs seized. Eleanor, the winter grant covers our heating oil and veterinary supplies. We have fragile animals here. Is this a clerical issue? Because I can send over the updated tax forms right now. It is not a clerical issue, Stephanie. Eleanor let out a heavy sigh, sounding genuinely disappointed. Patricia spoke with several board members at the Casco Bay Yacht Club last night. She was in tears. She told us about your father's passing and how the inheritance changed you. She told us about the erratic behavior, the sudden cruelty toward Derek. She said you packed your bags the moment the California money cleared and abandoned your marriage. The board cannot risk associating our charity with someone experiencing such a severe mental break. The phone receiver felt like lead in my hand. Patricia had not just stolen my home and my mother's pearls. She was actively dismantling my reputation brick by brick. She was using her status in the elite coastal society to paint me as a greedy, unstable villain. Eleanor, please, you have to listen to me, I started, the panic rising in my throat. None of that is true. Derek changed the locks. He took everything. I am sorry, Stephanie. Please do not contact the foundation again until you seek professional help. The line went dead. I stood there listening to the dial tone. Patricia was executing a flawless preemptive strike. In close-knit New England coastal towns, social currency is everything. Patricia held the keys to the kingdom, and she was using them to lock me in the dungeon. By portraying me as the abuser, she insulated Derek from any suspicion. Who would question a grieving husband trying to protect himself from an unhinged, newly wealthy wife? My first instinct was pure, burning retaliation. I pulled out my cell phone, my thumbs hovering over the screen. I wanted to draft a public post. I wanted to expose the drained bank accounts, the forged commercial loans, the changed locks. I wanted to scream the truth from the docks until the whole town heard me. But then, Jonathan Reed's voice echoed in my memory. You give them total, terrifying silence. I closed my eyes and slowly lowered the phone. A public screaming match would just make me look exactly how Patricia described me. Unstable, erratic, desperate. Jonathan needed a paper trail of defamation, and Patricia was currently digging her own grave in front of the wealthiest people in the state. I had to let her hand us the shovel. The rest of the week became a masterclass in psychological torture. The smear campaign spread like a salt fire. 2 more corporate sponsors pulled their funding. Delivery vendors who used to chat with me about the weather suddenly required upfront cash payments for fish and medical supplies, treating me with a cold, nervous distance. The isolation peaked on a Thursday evening. I needed basic groceries for my motel room. I walked into the local market wearing my faded waterproof jacket and sensible boots. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glare on the linoleum aisles. I pushed my cart toward the produce section and froze. Standing near the apples was Susan, a woman who had invited Derek and me to her summer clam bakes for the last 5 years. We had shared bottles of wine on her patio, laughing until the sun dipped below the Atlantic. Susan looked up and made direct eye contact with me. I offered a small, hesitant smile, raising my hand to wave. Susan stiffened. Her eyes darted away. She turned her shopping cart around so fast the wheels squeaked against the floor and practically sprinted down the adjacent aisle to avoid speaking to me. I stood alone, next to a display of bruised fruit, my hand still half raised in the air. The sting of social exile is a very specific kind of pain. It hollows you out from the inside, leaving an echoing chamber of self-doubt. I abandoned my cart and walked out into the freezing parking lot, the night air biting at my cheeks. They were winning. My husband and his mother were erasing my existence without lifting a single finger in public. I drove back to the wildlife center instead of the motel. The building was dark and freezing. I had turned the thermostats down to conserve whatever heating oil we had left, saving the warmth for the animal recovery wards. I sat on a wooden crate in the center of the main equipment bay, my breath pluming in the frigid air. At my feet lay a massive commercial fishing net. It had washed up on the rocks, torn and tangled, a dangerous trap for the local marine life. I pulled a pair of thick leather gloves onto my freezing hands and grabbed a splicing needle. I began to repair the net. The thick nylon cord was unyielding, fighting against my stiff fingers, but I forced the needle through the frayed knots, pulling the synthetic threads tight. I tied one knot, then another, then another. My knuckles ached. A small blister formed on the side of my thumb and broke, stinging with the salt residue trapped in the fibers. I did not stop. I focused the entirety of my swirling, agonizing frustration into the physical act of mending the broken mesh. This net was my life. Derek and Patricia had taken a knife to it, slashing the central supports, expecting the whole thing to unravel into useless string. They expected me to sit in the dirt and weep over the pieces. But they forgot who raised me. My father did not raise a victim. He raised a woman who knew how to weather a nor'easter. As I pulled a final heavy knot tight, securing a massive tear in the fabric, a quiet, profound realization settled over me. Isolation is not just a punishment. It is a crucible. In the absence of friends, in the absence of a husband, in the absence of a comfortable home, all the noise fades away. You are left with absolute clarity. Patricia was arrogant. She was putting on a beautiful theatrical performance for the yacht club. But theater requires an audience, and it requires constant energy to maintain the illusion. Derek, on the other hand, was playing a much darker game. Forging commercial loan documents is a felony. It carries federal prison time. A successful real estate broker does not risk a federal indictment just to spite his wife during a divorce. I set the heavy splicing needle down on the concrete floor. The silence of the freezing room felt different now. It no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a war room. Derek was terrified of something. He needed cash, fast, and he needed me out of the way to get it. He had swept our personal accounts and leveraged my sanctuary because he was drowning. I stood up, brushing the dirt and salt from my canvas trousers. I walked into the dark office and booted up my computer, the screen casting a pale blue glow across my face. How he managed the fake sale of our marital home so quickly. A deed transfer requires a notary present to witness the signatures. I pulled up the public property records database for the county. My fingers flew across the keyboard, searching for the recent transfer of my home address. The document loaded on the screen, detailing the shift from my name into a blind holding company. I scrolled down to the bottom of the scanned page, focusing on the official state notary stamp pressed into the digital paper. The name on the stamp made the breath catch in my throat. Lauren, the junior title agent. The woman who had obsessed over my crown molding. The woman with the expensive perfume. I leaned back in my chair, the puzzle pieces snapping together with terrifying precision. Lauren had not just dropped off routine paperwork last month. She had been scouting the property. She was the one processing the fraudulent deeds. But a junior agent does not risk her license and her freedom just to do her boss a favor. She risks it because she thinks she is securing her own future. My husband was not just hiding a financial crisis. He was hiding a mistress. And the mistress had just left her fingerprints all over a federal crime. I reached for my coat, a cold, genuine smile finally touching my lips. It was time to go hunting. The sun had barely broken over the Atlantic horizon, casting a bruised purple light across the frost-covered docks when my phone vibrated against the metal workbench. I had spent the night sleeping on a rigid canvas cot in the Wildlife Center break room. My muscles ached from the cold, but my mind felt sharper than it had in days. I picked up the receiver. It was Jonathan Reed. "Good morning, Stephanie," he said, his tone clipped and professional. "I have the preliminary trace on the holding company that purchased your property." "Tell me," I replied, wrapping a thick wool blanket tighter around my shoulders. "The entity is a shell corporation registered in Delaware, but the localized transfer documents required an in-state notary to process the deed." Jonathan paused, the rustle of heavy paper echoing through the line. "The individual who stamped the final authorization is an employee at your husband's brokerage, a junior title agent named Lauren." I closed my eyes. The name settled into my chest, heavy and cold as a stone. I pictured the young woman standing in my foyer a month prior, her manicured fingernails tracing the custom woodwork my father and I had painstakingly installed. She had not been admiring the architecture. She had been measuring the drapes. "She is not just an employee, Jonathan," I said, my voice dropping to a hollow whisper. "She is his mistress." Jonathan remained silent for a long moment, letting the gravity of the revelation settle between us. A forged real estate transfer, executed by a romantic partner, elevates this from a contentious divorce to a coordinated conspiracy. He finally replied, "Do not confront her. We need them complacent." I hung up the phone and walked to the window, staring out at the gray, churning ocean. A primal instinct flared in my blood, urging me to drive to Portland, to kick down my own front door and drag that woman out by her designer collar. But rage is a sloppy tactician. I needed to see the battlefield for myself, without alerting the enemy. I borrowed Megan's rusted station wagon, knowing my leased sedan would be instantly recognizable. The drive down the coast felt excruciatingly slow. The heater in the old car barely worked, forcing me to grip the cracked leather steering wheel with stiff, freezing fingers. When I reached my old neighborhood, I parked 2 blocks down the street, pulling my knit beanie low over my forehead. My former home sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, flanked by towering pine trees that shielded the property from the harsh sea winds. A sleek black luxury SUV was parked in the driveway. The trunk was wide open. I watched through the salt-stained windshield as Lauren emerged from the front door. She wore a pristine, cream-colored trench coat and knee-high leather boots, looking every bit the affluent society wife she desperately wanted to be. A bright, eager smile stretched across her face. She carried an armful of expensive garment bags and a set of matching monogrammed luggage, hauling them from the SUV into the foyer. She moved with a sense of giddy ownership, pausing on the front steps to admire the brass light fixtures framing the entryway. She believed she had won the lottery. She thought she had secured a wealthy tycoon, a man who could provide her with country club memberships and weekend trips to the Hamptons. I picked up my phone, zooming the camera lens through the windshield. I tapped the screen, capturing image after image. The click of the digital shutter was the only sound in the quiet car. I documented the luggage, the vehicle, the undeniable proof of her establishing residency in my stolen house. I felt no urge to scream. Watching her parade around in her cream coat, I just felt a deep, icy pity. She had no idea she was moving into a house built on quicksand. I did not know it at the time, but while Lauren was busy arranging her imported shoes in my cedar closet, Derek was experiencing a very different kind of morning. Across town, in his sleek downtown corner office, my husband was suffocating. The audience of his life saw a polished broker with a perfect smile. But behind the closed oak door of his private suite, Derek sat slumped in his ergonomic chair, his tie loosened, his tailored shirt damp with sweat. Spread across his glass desk was a ledger of overdue debts that would make a seasoned gambler weep. He was staring down a financial abyss. His luxury development projects had stalled, Private equity lenders were calling his personal cell phone, leaving voicemails that promised severe physical consequences if their investments were not repaid. He had orchestrated the fake sale of our house and leveraged my wildlife center because he was broke. He was a hollow shell of a man, pretending to be a king. Lauren thought she was moving in with a millionaire, but she was actually shackling herself to a sinking ship. I finished taking my photos and drove back to the Coastal Rehabilitation Center. The cold air had chilled me to the bone, so I decided to stop at a small independent coffee shop a few miles from the sanctuary. The bell above the door chimed, announcing my arrival in the warm, roasted-smelling cafe. I ordered a black coffee and turned toward the seating area. My breath caught. Sitting at a corner table, wearing a pristine gray suit, was Derek. He had not found me here by accident. He had been tracking my routine, waiting for an opportunity to corner me away from my staff. He stood up as I approached, blocking my path to the exit. "Stephanie, we need to talk," he said, his tone attempting to convey an easy, relaxed authority. I tightened my grip on the paper cup, letting the heat seep into my palms. "I have nothing to say to you, Derek. Speak to my lawyer." He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial hum. "Let us not make this harder than it has to be. I brought a preliminary settlement offer. It is generous. You sign the release on the Portland house today, and I will walk away without asking for spousal support. We can end this quietly." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a folded legal document, sliding it across the small wooden table. He tried to maintain his confident stare, trying to project the image of an untouchable winner, offering a merciful out to a defeated opponent. But Jonathan had trained me to look closer. I did not look at his eyes. I looked down at his hands. Derek reached for his own ceramic coffee mug resting on the table. As his fingers wrapped around the handle, a fine, rapid tremor traveled up his wrist. He lifted the cup, and the ceramic base rattled audibly against the saucer. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. My husband was shaking. His knuckles were white, the tendons in his hand standing out in stark relief. He took a hasty sip of his coffee, trying to mask the tremor, but the hot liquid sloshed dangerously close to the rim. I looked back up at his face. The pristine gray suit could not hide the dark circles under his eyes. The expensive cologne could not mask the sour metallic scent of pure adrenaline radiating from his skin. He was not here to offer me a generous deal. He was here because he needed my signature to legitimize his fraud before the clock ran out. I let the silence stretch between us, letting him sit in the discomfort of his own trembling hands. I did not yell. I did not throw my drink in his face. I simply leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. "You look tired, Derek," I said, my voice soft, smooth, and steady. His jaw tightened. A flash of genuine panic broke through his polished facade. "Just sign the paper, Stephanie. Do not drag this out." I picked up the folded document and slid it back across the wood until it touched his knuckles. "I think I will take my time," I replied, holding his gaze. "After all, you have already moved Lauren into the house. What is the rush?" The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost in a tailored suit. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He had expected a weeping, hysterical victim begging for her life back. He had not prepared for a woman who knew his secrets and refused to flinch. I turned my back on him and walked out of the coffee shop, the bell chiming a cheerful goodbye. The icy wind hit my face as I crossed the parking lot, but I did not feel cold anymore. Derek was not a master manipulator executing a flawless plan. He was a cornered animal, trapped in a burning building of his own making. And I was standing outside, holding the only key to the exit. I unlocked the station wagon, pulling the brass compass from my pocket. The needle settled quickly, pointing straight ahead. The fear that had gripped my chest for days evaporated entirely. The hunt had officially shifted, and my husband had no idea how outmatched he truly was. The icy wind whipping off the harbor felt different now as I walked to the station wagon. The fear that had tightened my chest for days was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating hum. I drove back toward the sanctuary, the heater barely taking the edge off the winter chill. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat, vibrating against the cracked leather. The screen flashed Jonathan Reed's name. I answered, putting him on speaker. "Stephanie, we have a situation," Jonathan said, his voice tighter than usual. "I need you at my office right now. A courier just dropped off an emergency filing from your husband's legal team. They hired a high-profile litigation firm out of Boston. They filed an injunction in California this morning to freeze the Lake Tahoe estate." I pressed my foot harder on the accelerator, the engine of the old wagon whining in protest. "On what grounds?" I asked, gripping the steering wheel. "The deed is in my name. The trust is clear." Jonathan paused, letting the weight of his next words sink in. "They produced a post-nuptial agreement. It states that you willingly granted Derek 50% of all future inheritances in the event of a divorce. If the judge in California accepts it, you lose $3 million, and the property remains locked in probate hell." My tires screeched slightly as I took a sharp turn toward downtown Portland. "I never signed a postnup, Jonathan. Not ever." When I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the law firm 20 minutes later, I found Jonathan standing beside a long mahogany conference table. Next to him stood a slender, older woman, wearing wire-rimmed glasses and a tailored tweed blazer. A series of high-powered magnifying lenses and bright halogen lamps were set up across the polished wood. "Stephanie, this is Dr. Eris Thorne," Jonathan introduced her, gesturing to the table. "She is a forensic document examiner. I called her the moment the courier arrived." I stepped closer, staring down at the pristine white pages laid out under the harsh glare of the lamps. The document was 5 pages long, detailing a dense labyrinth of legalese that effectively stripped me of my family legacy. I turned to the final page, my breath hitched. Right there, sitting above a crisp black line, was my signature. It was not a forgery. It was the exact looping cursive I used for official documents. I leaned closer, my mind reeling. "I signed this," I whispered, tracing the air above the ink. "But I never read it. How is that possible?" Jonathan crossed his arms. "Look at the context, Stephanie. When is the document dated?" I checked the top corner. October, 3 years ago. The realization hit me like a physical blow. October was the month I always finalized the annual tax filings for the Wildlife Center. Derek handled our personal finances, and he routinely brought me stacks of dense tax schedules to sign. He would flip to the last page, point to the dotted line, and tell me we were running late for a dinner reservation. He had slipped this signature page into a pile of mundane charity tax returns. He stole my future while I was putting on my coat. "But a signature alone does not make a binding contract, Dr. Thorne," interjected her voice dry and precise. "A postnuptial agreement requires a licensed notary to verify that both parties signed willingly and understood the terms." She slid a specialized magnifying glass over the bottom corner of the page, tapping a faded blue ink stamp. I looked through the lens. The circular stamp bore the official seal of the state of Maine, and right in the center sat a familiar name. Lauren. "The mistress," I murmured, the bitterness coating my tongue. She notarized it. Dr. Thorne adjusted the halogen lamp, casting a stark shadow across the paper. "She did, but arrogance makes people careless. Your husband and his title agent thought they were very clever slipping your legitimate signature onto a fraudulent contract. However, they made a fatal chronological error." Dr. Thorne pulled a separate folder from her briefcase, producing a printout from the state licensing board. She placed it next to the forged contract. "Lauren renewed her notary commission last year, When the state issues a new commission, they alter the identification number on the physical stamp by 2 digits to track the renewal. Dr. Thorne pointed to the blue ink on the postnup. This stamp contains her current identification number, but the document is dated 3 years ago. The room went dead silent. I stared at the mismatched numbers, my pulse pounding in my ears. Lauren used her current stamp and backdated the paperwork. Jonathan clarified his tone, laced with a dangerous edge. She committed perjury. She fabricated a legal document to steal $3 million across state lines. This is no longer a messy divorce, Stephanie. This is a coordinated conspiracy. We are looking at wire fraud, perjury, and racketeering. They handed us a federal case. I breathed, the magnitude of their mistake washing over me. Derek brought in a Boston shark to freeze my assets, and instead, he just handed us the murder weapon. Jonathan gathered the documents, slipping them into a secure lockbox. We do not reveal this yet. If we show our hand today, the Boston lawyers will withdraw the filing and claim it was an administrative error. We wait until they submit this into evidence under oath. We let them lock themselves inside the burning building. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling window of the law office, looking out over the Portland harbor. The gray waves crashed against the stone breakwater, sending plumes of white foam into the freezing air. I was a wildlife director, not a lawyer. I spent my life healing broken wings and untangling fishing lines. Now I was standing on the precipice of sending my husband to prison. Watching the boats rock in the harbor, a memory surfaced from deep within my childhood. I was 12 years old, kneeling on a slippery wooden dock beside my father. The smell of old bait and sea salt hung heavy in the damp air. A commercial lobster trap had washed ashore, tangled in a chaotic knot of heavy nylon rope and rusted wire. I had spent an hour pulling at the loose ends of the rope, trying to free the cage, pulling harder and harder until my hands bled. My father had knelt beside me, placing his large, calloused hand over my small, trembling ones. He gently pulled my fingers away from the frayed edges. "Do not pull the loose ends, Steph," he had said, his voice a low, comforting rumble over the sound of the ocean. When a trap is this tangled, pulling the edges just makes the center tighter. You have to trace the lines back to the source, find the anchor knot and cut it. The rest will fall apart on its own. Find the anchor knot. I opened my eyes, bringing my focus back to the reflection in the office window. The trap Derek had set for me was a tangled mess of stolen money, frozen assets, and society rumors. Patricia was pulling one end, spreading lies at the yacht club. Derek was pulling another, trying to bully me into a settlement. Lauren was pulling a third, notarizing fake deeds and dreaming of a wealthy future. They thought they were an impenetrable, united front. But they were just a knot, holding each other together out of greed and desperation. I turned back to Jonathan. "The anchor knot," I said, my voice ringing with newfound clarity. Jonathan arched an eyebrow. "Excuse me," Patricia, Derek, and Lauren I explained, pacing across the polished floor. "They are working together because they think they share the same goal. Lauren thinks she is marrying a rich man. Patricia thinks she is saving her son's pristine reputation. Derek thinks he can appease them both while secretly hiding a debt. But none of them actually know the whole truth about each other." Jonathan smiled a slow, predatory grin that reached his piercing gray eyes. "You want to turn them against each other." "I do not want to fight them all at once," I replied, stopping in front of his desk. "I want to cut the anchor knot. I want Lauren to realize she is risking federal prison for a man who is secretly broke. I want Patricia to realize her son is a fraud. If we cut the trust between them, their entire conspiracy will collapse under its own weight." Jonathan unlocked his desk drawer and pulled out a thick red file folder. "Then you are going to need the rest of the ammunition. My forensic accountant finished digging into your husband's corporate ledgers this morning. What we found goes far beyond a few overdue loans. He slid the red folder across the mahogany wood. Derek is not just broke, Stephanie. He is hiding a secret that is going to destroy his mother. Jonathan slid the thick red folder across the polished mahogany desk. The heavy thud of the paper hitting the wood felt like a gavel dropping in an empty courtroom. Derek is not just broke, Stephanie. He is hiding a secret that is going to destroy his mother. I pulled the folder toward me, my fingers tracing the rigid edge of the cardboard. I had spent the last week believing my husband was a greedy, desperate man trying to secure a comfortable life with a younger woman. I thought he had drained our accounts and leveraged my wildlife center because his business was failing. But as I opened the cover and stared at the columns of numbers, I realized my imagination had been far too small. The documents were internal ledgers from Derek's real estate development company. My forensic accountant pulled these from a shadow server. Jonathan explained, his voice low and precise. Your husband owes $5 million to a private equity firm in Boston. $5 million. I whispered the number, catching in my throat. I stared at the dense rows of transactions, trying to comprehend the sheer scale of the deficit. How does a regional broker lose $5 million without anyone noticing? He did not lose it, Jonathan replied, leaning back in his leather chair. He stole it. I looked up, my eyes locking onto Jonathan's stoic expression. What? Flip to page 3, Jonathan instructed. Look at the origin accounts for the initial investments in his failed luxury condo project. I turned the page, scanning the list of names. My breath hitched. I recognized every single one of them. The names belonged to the matriarchs and patriarchs of Maine's coastal elite. These were the people who attended the yacht club galas, the people who funded the local hospital wings, the people Patricia spent her entire life trying to impress. These are Patricia's friends, I said, my voice trembling with sudden realization. They are more than friends, Jonathan corrected. They are retirees. Derek convinced them to invest their pension funds and liquid retirement assets into a high-yield development fund he controlled. He promised them guaranteed returns. Instead, he funneled their money into a shell corporation to cover his own massive gambling debts and reckless personal spending over the last 4 years. He embezzled $5 million from the wealthiest, most vindictive people in New England. The puzzle pieces clicked together with deafening clarity. The frantic pace of the divorce, the sudden lockout, the aggressive smear campaign Patricia was waging at the yacht club. Patricia knows, I breathed, leaning back in my chair. She knows he stole the money. She absolutely knows, Jonathan confirmed. If the country club finds out her son embezzled their retirement funds, Patricia will not just lose her social standing, she will be a pariah. She will be exiled from the only society she values. The Lake Tahoe inheritance is not just a greedy payout for Derek. It is his literal get-out-of-jail-free card. He needs your $3 million to pay back the Boston private equity firm he borrowed from, to try and cover up the original embezzlement. If he does not get your money, he goes to federal prison. I stared out the window, at the freezing rain lashing against the glass. The narrative had completely flipped. I was no longer a victim fighting to keep my home. I was holding the only life raft in a violent storm, and my husband was drowning. The realization flooded my veins with a cold, potent adrenaline. Patricia had called me unstable. She had spread rumors that I abandoned Derek because I was greedy, but the entire time she was standing in front of her wealthy friends, smiling and sipping champagne. She was desperately trying to cover up the fact that her son had robbed them blind. This changes everything, I said, closing the red folder. They are not negotiating from a position of strength. They are negotiating with a gun to their heads. Exactly, Jonathan agreed. Derek filed that injunction in California because his lenders in Boston are breathing down his neck. He needs to show them he has incoming capital. We have the leverage now, but we must use it carefully. I left the law office feeling lighter than I had in weeks. The crushing weight of the betrayal was still there, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was focused. I drove out of downtown Portland, taking the winding coastal road toward the Wildlife Center. The sky was a bruised gray, the ocean churning against the jagged rocks. I pulled into the gravel parking lot of a small seaside shack, a place my father and I used to visit after long days on the water. The wooden siding was weathered by the salt wind, the windows clouded with condensation. I ordered a solitary lobster roll and sat at a small table overlooking the harbor. The warm, buttery meat was a sharp contrast to the freezing wind whistling through the cracks in the walls. I took a slow bite, watching a lone seagull circle the docks. A genuine, chilling smile touched my lips. My silence was working. By refusing to scream, refusing to defend myself publicly, I had forced Derek and Patricia into a state of manic aggression. They were overplaying their hand, making reckless, documented mistakes because they were terrified. They thought they were hunting me, but they had blindly sprinted into a tactical minefield. I finished my meal and drove the rest of the way to the sanctuary. Megan was waiting for me in the main equipment bay, holding a clipboard and looking incredibly tense. "Stephanie, we have a problem," she said the moment I walked through the door. I hung my damp coat on a hook, bracing myself for the next blow. "What is it?" Megan handed me the clipboard. "A courier just dropped this off. It is from the commercial landlord who owns this building." I scanned the single sheet of paper, my stomach dropping. It was a formal eviction notice. The landlord was giving the Wildlife Center 14 days to vacate the premises, citing a sudden obscure zoning violation. "This makes no sense," I said, my eyes darting across the legal jargon. "We have occupied this building for 6 years. Our lease is ironclad for another 24 months. I checked the signature at the bottom of the page. Richard Vance. I recognized the name immediately. Richard Vance was a commercial real estate developer who frequently partnered with Derek's brokerage. He was a man who owed my husband several lucrative favors. Derek was calling in his markers. "He is trying to squeeze me," I murmured, handing the clipboard back to Megan. "He knows the California injunction will take months to process. His lenders will not wait that long. He needs me to sign the post-nup now, so he is threatening the sanctuary to force my hand." "What do we do?" Megan asked, her voice tight with panic. "We have 3 recovering seals in the critical care tanks. We have 20 pelicans in the flight enclosures. We cannot move this facility in 14 days. The animals will not survive the transport." I looked around the freezing concrete bay, listening to the faint hum of the filtration pumps. Derek was attacking the only thing I had left in the world that mattered. He was threatening innocent animals to save his own skin. "Call Jonathan," I instructed, my voice steady and cold. "Tell him to draft a response to the eviction notice, delaying it in municipal court. It will buy us a few weeks." And then what Megan asked. I turned back to the door, pulling my coat off the hook. "And then I am going to set a fire right in the middle of my husband's new life." I walked out to the station wagon, the brass compass heavy in my pocket. If Derek wanted to play dirty, I was going to show him exactly how ruthless a wounded wolf could be. He was using his leverage to threaten my sanctuary. I was going to use my leverage to destroy his safe haven. Lauren thought she was marrying a wealthy tycoon. It was time for the mistress to find out exactly who she was sharing a bed with. I pulled out my phone and dialed Jonathan's private cell. "Jonathan," I said as soon as he answered, "I need you to send a very specific package to Lauren's office at the title agency. Use an anonymous courier." "What goes in the package?" Jonathan asked, his tone shifting into tactical mode. "Copies of Derek's internal ledgers," I replied, merging onto the coastal highway. "The overdue loan notices from the Boston private equity firm, the foreclosure warnings, everything that proves he is totally, utterly bankrupt." I hung up the phone and pressed the accelerator. The hunters were about to realize they were bleeding, and the sharks were already circling. The tension inside Jonathan Reed's office the following morning was thick enough to cut with a knife. The sleet had stopped, leaving downtown Portland coated in a brittle layer of ice that cracked under the weight of passing cars. I sat across from Jonathan, my hands wrapped tightly around a mug of bitter black coffee. The eviction notice for my wildlife sanctuary sat like a live grenade in the center of the mahogany table. Derek is leveraging your physical property to force an immediate surrender of the Tahoe estate, Jonathan observed, his fingers steepling beneath his chin. He cannot afford the legal delays of an injunction. The private equity lenders are closing in. I set my mug down, the ceramic clinking sharply against the coaster. Then we give him exactly what he wants. Jonathan raised a skeptical eyebrow. We surrender $3 million to a man who committed felony forgery? No, I replied, a hard, cold smile touching my lips. We pretend to surrender. I leaned forward, laying out the strategy that had kept me awake all night. Derek is arrogant Jonathan. He expects me to fold because he thinks he has cornered me. If we fight him, he will just keep squeezing my nonprofit. But if we suddenly agree to negotiate, if we tell his Boston lawyers that I am willing to honor the forged postnuptial agreement, he will think he won. He will take that preliminary agreement straight to his lenders to buy himself time. Jonathan's eyes narrowed, his legal mind instantly grasping the maneuver. A red herring. We draft a preliminary settlement, agreeing in principle to the division of the Tahoe assets. We request minor administrative adjustments to the language to drag out the final signing. Exactly, I nodded. And what does a desperate man do when he believes a massive payout is only 3 weeks away? He borrows against it, Jonathan finished, his voice dropping into a dangerous hum. If Derek believed the $3 million was guaranteed, he would take out short-term, high-interest bridge loans to appease the private equity firm in Boston. He would dig his financial grave so deep he would never be able to climb out. We were not just going to beat him in court, we were going to let his own greed destroy him. Jonathan immediately drafted a formal letter of intent to Derek's high-priced litigation firm. The language was meticulously crafted to sound defeated, yet cautious, requesting minor adjustments to the liability clauses and tax distribution schedules. It was the perfect bait. Within 48 hours, the strategy yielded terrifying results. My forensic accountant, tracking Derek's shadow ledgers, flagged a massive influx of capital into his development firm. Derek had leveraged the preliminary settlement agreement to secure a $2 million bridge loan from an aggressive, unregulated lending syndicate. He used the cash to pay the interest on his embezzled country club funds, temporarily holding the wolves at bay. He was dancing on a razor wire, and he had no idea the wire was already severed. While Derek was busy mortgaging a future he would never possess, Patricia was taking a victory lap through Maine's coastal high society. The annual Casco Bay Winter Gala was held that Saturday at the local yacht club. I obviously did not attend, but the society blogs and social media pages were flooded with photographs by the next morning. I sat in my freezing motel room, scrolling through the images on my phone. There was Patricia, standing in the center of the grand ballroom, holding a flute of expensive champagne. She wore a stunning emerald green gown, her hair perfectly coiffed. She looked every inch the triumphant matriarch, having successfully excommunicated her unstable daughter-in-law. But my eyes were not focused on her smile. I zoomed in on the photograph, my breath catching in my throat. Resting against her collarbone, illuminated by the flash of the cameras, was my mother's vintage pearl necklace. She was parading stolen property in front of the very people her son had defrauded. The sheer audacity of the act made my blood boil. But it also provided a crucial piece of leverage. I closed the social media app and dialed my insurance broker. The agency had handled my father's estate and all of our family heirlooms for decades. "Hi, Marcus," I said, keeping my voice light and professional. I need you to pull the archived appraisal file from my late mother's pearl necklace, the one with the custom laurel wreath clasp. I can certainly do that, Stephanie Marcus replied, the sound of keyboard clicking echoing over the line. Do you need the updated valuation for the estate transfer? Yes, I lied smoothly. I need the original photographs, the distinct jeweler marks, and the full certified appraisal document emailed to me today. When the file arrived in my inbox 20 minutes later, I forwarded it directly to Jonathan. Patricia thought she was wearing a trophy of her victory over me. She had no idea she was wearing the exact piece of evidence we needed to freeze her personal assets when the time came. The pressure began to bubble as the week progressed. Derek's Boston lawyers began pressing aggressively for the final signatures on the Tahoe settlement. They sent daily emails, their tone shifting from professional to thinly veiled hostility. They demanded an in-person mediation to finalize the division of assets. Derek needed the final contract. The bridge loans he had taken out were compounding daily. He was sweating, and his desperation was making him sloppy. I agreed to the mediation, setting the date for the following Thursday. The morning of the meeting, I stood in front of the motel mirror adjusting the collar of my sharpest black suit. I pulled my hair back into a sleek knot, eliminating any trace of the rugged wildlife director who spent her days in salt-stained boots. Today, I was a strategist, walking into a trap of my own design. We held the mediation in a neutral conference room downtown. The space was sterile glass walls, gray carpet, and a heavy oak table that felt like a battlefield trench. Derek arrived with his lead counsel, a shark named Harrison, who wore an expensive suit and a condescending sneer. Derek looked exhausted. The tailored navy blazer hung slightly loose on his frame, and the dark circles under his eyes betrayed the crushing weight of his hidden debts. To my absolute shock, Patricia walked into the room behind them. She had no legal standing in a divorce mediation, but she carried herself as though she owned the building. She took a seat directly across from me, placing her designer handbag on the table. She wanted a front row seat to my surrender. Harrison opened his leather briefcase, extracting the final settlement documents. He slid them across the table, his gold watch catching the fluorescent light. "Stephanie," he began, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "We are pleased you have decided to honor the postnuptial agreement. If you sign these documents today, Derek is prepared to waive any claim to your nonprofit and allow you to remain in Maine undisturbed." I looked down at the forged paperwork. The trap was perfectly set. If I signed my name, I legitimized the felony and surrendered my father's legacy to a man who had stolen my life. I looked up, meeting Derek's gaze. His hands were resting on the table, the knuckles white. The faint, rapid tremor I had noticed at the coffee shop was back. He was holding his breath, waiting for the ink to dry on his salvation. I reached for the silver pen resting on the contract. I picked it up, feeling the cool metal against my skin. Patricia leaned forward, a smug, satisfied smirk playing on her lips. She thought she had broken me. She thought she had won, but I did not uncap the pen. I slowly, deliberately slid the pen back across the table until it rested in front of Harrison. "I am afraid there has been a slight misunderstanding," I said, my voice dropping to a low, icy calm. "I have no intention of signing this document." The room went dead silent. Harrison's sneer vanished, replaced by genuine confusion. Patricia stiffened her smirk, faltering. Derek slammed his hands flat against the oak table, the tremor translating into a violent shake. "What are you doing, Stephanie?" he demanded, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated panic. "We had a deal." "We had a preliminary discussion, Derek," I corrected, leaning back in my chair. "But I simply cannot sign a document that contains a forged notary stamp." Harrison narrowed his eyes, turning sharply toward Derek. "A forged stamp? What is she talking about?" I did not let Derek answer. I kept my eyes locked entirely on him, watching the color drain from his face as the realization hit him. The notary commission number on this document belongs to your junior agent, Lauren I., stated the words, dropping like anvils onto the table. But she used her current renewal stamp on a contract dated 3 years ago. Derek's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine and heard the click. Harrison immediately snatched the document from the table, his legal mind instantly recognizing the massive liability he had just presented. "If this is true," he snapped at Derek, his professional veneer cracking, "you just handed opposing counsel a federal crime." The mediation was over before it even began. Harrison shoved the paperwork into his briefcase, grabbed Derek by the arm, and dragged him out of the conference room. Patricia sat frozen, her eyes wide with shock, the smug victory completely erased from her face. I stood up, buttoning my suit jacket. I looked down at my mother-in-law. "You should enjoy the yacht club while you still can, Patricia," I said softly, "because a storm is coming and you are standing right on the shoreline." I walked out of the conference room, leaving her sitting alone in the cold, sterile silence. The red herring had worked flawlessly. Derek had mortgaged his life on a settlement he would never receive, and now his lawyers knew he had lied to them. The anchor knot was beginning to fray, and the real pressure was about to crush them all. The disastrous mediation left a shockwave that radiated across downtown Portland. Harrison dropped Derek as a client before the sun even set that evening. You do not lie to a Boston shark and expect to keep your legal representation. But Derek did not have time to find a new attorney. His unregulated bridge loans were compounding by the hour, and the private equity lenders were no longer asking politely for their money. Desperation breeds a very specific kind of cruelty. Since Derek could no longer use a courtroom to force my hand, he decided to bypass the law entirely. The following Tuesday morning, the temperature plummeted to a bitter 15 degrees. I was at the Wildlife Center helping Megan feed the recovering seal pups when the overhead fluorescent lights flickered and died. The steady, comforting hum of the commercial filtration tanks ground to a sudden halt. The heating vents stopped blowing warm air, plunging the massive concrete bays into a terrifying silence. I ran outside to the main utility box, expecting a blown fuse. Instead, I found 2 men in heavy canvas work jackets securing a heavy steel padlock through the main breaker switch. A bright yellow hazard notice was slapped across the metal door. "What are you doing?" I demanded, my breath pluming in the freezing air. "You cannot shut off our power. We have critical care marine life inside." One of the workers shrugged, pulling his thick gloves tighter. "Landlord orders lady. Richard Vance filed an emergency municipal hazard claim. He says the wiring in your building is a fire risk. We have orders to kill the grid until you vacate. You have 14 days to clear the property." They climbed into their utility truck and drove away, leaving me standing in the sleet. Richard Vance was not playing by the rules of standard eviction anymore. An emergency hazard claim bypassed normal tenant protections. Without power, the water in the rehabilitation tanks would freeze within 48 hours. The pelicans would not survive the night without the heat lamps. Derek was no longer just threatening my livelihood. He was threatening the lives of the innocent creatures I had sworn to protect. I walked back into the dark, freezing sanctuary. Megan was already wrapping the transport cages in thermal emergency blankets, her hands shaking from the cold and the panic. A sleek black luxury SUV crunched onto the gravel driveway outside. The engine cut off, and the heavy door slammed shut. Derek walked into the main equipment bay. He did not look like the polished, charismatic real estate broker I had married. His tailored coat was wrinkled, his tie hung loose around his neck, and his eyes were bloodshot. He looked frantic, hollowed out by the invisible ticking clock of his catastrophic debts. He stopped a few feet away from me, his breath visible in the frigid room. "It does not have to be this way, Stephanie," he said, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. I stared at him, my hands balled into tight fists at my sides. You shut off the power to a wildlife hospital. You are going to kill these animals. Richard Vance shut off the power, Derek corrected, taking a step closer. But I can make a phone call and have the grid turned back on in 5 minutes. I can make the eviction notice disappear permanently. All you have to do is sign a simple waiver, abandoning your claim to the Tahoe property. You save your sanctuary, and we both walk away. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket, offering it to me like a lifeline. He thought he had found my breaking point. He thought my love for this sanctuary would override my pursuit of justice. He expected me to fall to my knees and beg him to save the animals. I looked away from his outstretched hand, gazing around the dark, quiet room. The silence was heavy, pressing against my shoulders. I reached into my coat pocket and wrapped my fingers around my father's solid brass compass. The cold metal grounded me, pulling my racing thoughts back to a steady center. My father built the Tahoe estate from nothing. He taught me the value of standing firm when the tide tries to pull you under. If I signed that paper, I would be validating a felony. I would be handing my father's legacy to a man who stole from retirees. And even if Derek turned the power back on today, he would just use this leverage again tomorrow. Negotiating with a terrorist only guarantees future hostage situations. I pulled my hand out of my pocket, leaving the compass inside. I met Derek's bloodshot eyes, my gaze steady and unyielding. "Turn around and walk out that door, Derek," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. His face contorted with sudden, desperate fury. "Are you insane, Stephanie? The animals will freeze to death. You are going to lose everything because you are too stubborn to surrender." I stepped forward, closing the distance between us until I was inches from his face. "We have backup generators, fueled and ready in the storage shed," I replied smoothly. "The enclosures will stay warm, and my veterinary staff is already mobilizing transport to a sister facility up the coast." "You thought I was helpless without your permission. You were wrong. Now get off my property before I have you arrested for trespassing." Derek stared at me, his chest heaving. The realization that his ultimate trump card had failed hit him like a physical blow. He crumpled the paper in his hand, turned on his heel, and stormed out of the sanctuary. The black SUV spun its tires in the gravel, peeling out onto the coastal highway. He had tried to burn my world to the ground. It was time for me to return the favor. While Megan fired up the loud diesel generators, restoring heat and filtration to the critical care tanks, I went into my office and opened the secure lockbox Jonathan had provided. Inside was a thick manila envelope. It contained printouts of Derek's shadow ledgers, the desperate emails from the Boston private equity lenders, and the formal notices of default on the embezzled country club funds. It was the undeniable, documented proof that Derek was a bankrupt fraudster, teetering on the edge of federal prison. I sealed the envelope and drove 3 towns over to a small postal annex, dropping it into an anonymous collection box. The recipient address was carefully printed in block letters. It was directed to Lauren at the downtown title agency. The trap was set. The bait was in the mail. Now I just had to wait for the poison to work its way through their toxic alliance. The next afternoon, the sun broke through the gray winter clouds, casting a bright, deceptive light across the city of Portland. Inside the sleek, modern offices of the title agency, Lauren sat at her glass desk, sipping an expensive iced latte. She wore a new designer blouse, purchased with the credit card Derek had given her. She was planning the color scheme for the master bedroom of my stolen house, blissfully unaware of the financial tidal wave rushing toward her. A mail clerk dropped a stack of daily deliveries onto the corner of her desk. Among the glossy real estate brochures and corporate memos sat a thick, unmarked manila envelope. Lauren set her latte down and picked up the package. There was no return address. She slid a silver letter opener under the flap and pulled out the dense stack of financial documents. At first, she merely skimmed the top page, a crease forming between her perfectly shaped eyebrows. She recognized Derek's corporate letterhead, but the numbers did not make sense. She flipped to the second page, reading the urgent default notice from the Boston lenders. Her pulse began to quicken. She turned to the third page, seeing the itemized ledger detailing the embezzled retirement funds from the yacht club members. The air vanished from her lungs. Lauren was a junior title agent. She understood property law, and she understood debt. As she stared at the undeniable proof of a $5 million deficit, the illusion of her wealthy tycoon boyfriend shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Derek did not have millions. He had nothing. He was borrowing against non-existent assets just to keep his kneecaps intact. And then, a far more terrifying realization settled over her. She had used her official state notary stamp to forge a property deed and a postnuptial agreement. She had committed 2 distinct felonies transferring stolen assets across state lines. She had risked her entire future, believing Derek would protect her with his vast fortune. But Derek could not even protect himself. When the federal authorities inevitably came knocking to investigate the missing country club pensions, they would find her forged stamps all over the real estate transfers. She was going to go to prison for a man who could not even afford to pay his own legal fees. Lauren dropped the documents onto her desk, her hands shaking violently. The walls of the pristine office felt like they were closing in. The designer blouse suddenly felt like a straitjacket. She picked up her cell phone and dialed Derek's private number, her manicured fingernails tapping frantically against the glass desk. The line rang 3 times before going straight to voicemail. Paranoia is a highly contagious disease. When you build a relationship on deceit and greed, trust is the first casualty of war. Lauren did not just feel betrayed, she felt hunted. And people who feel hunted will do whatever it takes to survive, even if it means throwing their accomplices to the wolves. The anchor knot tying Derek, Patricia, and Lauren together was no longer just fraying. It was snapping thread by thread. The collapse was imminent, and I was ready to watch the entire structure burn. I would later learn exactly how the poison worked its way through the stolen house in Portland. When you inject a lethal dose of truth into a relationship built on greed, the resulting infection is swift and terminal. Lauren had spent the entire afternoon staring at the anonymous financial documents scattered across her glass desk. The staggering deficit, the overdue loan notices, and the undeniable proof of embezzlement stripped away every fantasy she had harbored about her future. She did not leave work early. She sat frozen in her ergonomic chair until the sun dipped below the city skyline, paralyzed by the crushing weight of her own criminal liability. When she finally drove back to my former home that evening, the sleek, black luxury vehicle felt less like a trophy and more like a hearse. She unlocked the front door and stepped into the foyer. The house was dark, except for a single lamp burning in the study. Derek was pacing behind his heavy oak desk with a phone pressed tightly to his ear. Lauren stood in the shadows of the hallway, holding her breath and listening. Derek was speaking to a new attorney. His previous high-powered legal team had dropped him the moment they realized he handed them a forged contract. Now he was scrambling to find local defense counsel willing to take a case dripping with federal fraud implications. His voice echoed down the corridor, stripped of its usual polished charm. It sounded thin, frantic, and desperate. He was explaining the backdated postnuptial agreement to the new lawyer. Lauren heard her own name fall from his lips. She pressed her back against the cool plaster wall as Derek described the notary stamp. He did not defend her. He did not claim they made a mutual mistake. He asked the attorney a single, chilling question. If someone else took full responsibility for the stamp, would the federal prosecutor offer him immunity on the real estate transfer? Lauren closed her eyes, the remaining fragments of her illusion shattering into dust. Before Derek could finish the phone call, the front doorbell chimed. Patricia swept into the foyer, shaking the winter frost from her cashmere coat. She barely acknowledged Lauren, offering only a dismissive glance that one might reserve for a hired servant who had failed to polish the silver. Patricia walked straight past the junior title agent and pushed open the door to the study. Lauren crept closer to the cracked doorframe, her heart hammering against her ribs. Patricia did not mince words. She told her son that the country club rumors were growing impossible to control. The older woman demanded a solution to the frozen assets, and she demanded it immediately. Derek admitted that the forged notary stamp was the primary obstacle preventing any new legal maneuvers. The fraud was too obvious, too documented. Patricia offered her solution without a single ounce of hesitation. She told Derek to blame the girl. Standing in the hallway, Lauren listened to the woman who had happily sipped champagne with her just a week prior advocate for her total destruction. Patricia called Lauren a disposable asset. She suggested that Derek draft a sworn statement claiming the junior agent was dangerously obsessed with him. Patricia painted a pristine fictional narrative where Lauren forged the documents entirely on her own initiative, hoping to win Derek's affection and secure a place in his wealthy family. It was a brilliant, ruthless strategy. By framing Lauren as a rogue, infatuated employee, Derek became the unsuspecting victim of a jealous subordinate. Patricia assured him that with their family name and local influence, a judge would easily believe the polished broker over a naive young title agent. Derek agreed. He agreed to sacrifice the woman sleeping in his bed to save his own skin. Lauren did not scream. She did not burst into the room and confront them. The survival instinct in a cornered prey is profound. She backed away from the door, tiptoed up the stairs, and locked herself in the master bedroom. She waited in the dark, listening to the murmur of their voices, plotting her ruin. The next morning, after Derek left for his brokerage and Patricia returned to her manicured estate, Lauren crept back downstairs. She entered the study and logged into Derek's unlocked desktop computer. It only took her 3 minutes to find the file saved directly on his home screen. It was a draft of a sworn legal affidavit. Lauren printed the document and read the words holding the warm paper in her trembling hands. Derek had meticulously detailed a fabricated story of workplace harassment. He claimed Lauren had stolen his personal files, accessed his locked cabinets, and applied her state notary seal without his knowledge or consent. He requested full immunity from the forgery charges, offering to testify against her in federal court. She was looking at a signed execution order. She was going to take the fall for the entire conspiracy. She would lose her license, her freedom, and her future, while Derek and Patricia walked away clean. The terror that gripped her must have been suffocating. She had helped steal a home from a grieving daughter. She had mocked my career and coveted my life. But standing in that study, holding the proof of her own impending doom, Lauren finally understood the true cost of her ambition. She was never a partner in their empire. She was always the scapegoat, waiting to be slaughtered. Miles away, I was standing in the marine transport bay of the Wildlife Center, cleaning a set of surgical instruments. The winter sun streamed through the high windows, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. The sanctuary was quiet, the crisis of the power shutoff averted by our backup generators. My cell phone vibrated on the stainless steel counter. The caller identification displayed an unknown local number. I set the scalpel down, wiping the antiseptic wash from my hands with a rough towel. I did not answer. I let the phone ring until the automated voicemail picked up. A minute later, a notification chimed indicating a new audio message. I tapped the screen and pressed the speaker icon. The sound of ragged, panicked breathing filled the quiet room. "Stephanie," a voice whispered, trembling so violently the words barely formed. "This is Lauren." I leaned against the counter, staring at the glowing screen. "I know you have no reason to speak to me," the voice continued, breaking into a quiet, suppressed sob. But you were right. About everything. They are going to frame me for the forgery. Derek wrote an affidavit. He is going to hand me over to the federal prosecutor to hide his own debts. A sharp intake of breath hissed through the speaker. I have proof, Stephanie. I have the encrypted emails Patricia sent orchestrating the fake holding company. I have the digital footprint showing Derek directed the backdated postnuptial agreement. I have everything you need to destroy them both. Lauren paused, the sound of a passing siren wailing in the background of her recording. Please, she begged, her voice cracking with raw, unfiltered desperation. Do not let them do this to me. I will give you every piece of evidence I have. Just please meet with me. Name the place and I will be there. I am so sorry. The message ended, leaving a heavy, profound silence in the transport bay. I picked up the phone, locking the screen. I did not feel a sudden rush of triumphant joy. I did not feel an overwhelming sense of vindication. I just felt the cold, steady satisfaction of a hunter watching a trap snap shut. The anchor knot was officially severed. The alliance between the broker, the matriarch, and the mistress had imploded exactly as Jonathan and I had planned. Derek thought he had cleverly designed an escape hatch by throwing his accomplice overboard. He had no idea he had just handed his accomplice the match to burn his entire fleet to the ocean floor. I poured myself a cup of black coffee from the break room thermos, watching the steam curl into the frigid air. Lauren wanted a meeting. She wanted salvation. She thought she could trade her stolen evidence for a clean conscience and a free pass. I took a slow sip of the bitter dark roast. I would give her a meeting. I would take her evidence and use it to execute the final phase of my strategy. But I had no intention of offering her mercy. When you willingly participate in the destruction of an innocent life, you do not get to complain when the debris falls on your own head. I pulled my phone back out and typed a single short text message to the unknown number dictating the time and the coordinates for a secluded coastal lighthouse at the edge of the county. I hit send, slipping the device back into my pocket. The final pieces were moving into position. The pressure cooker had finally detonated, and the blast radius was going to be spectacular. The Portland headlight sat on a jagged outcrop of rock jutting into the freezing Atlantic Ocean. It was a rugged, isolated location where the wind whipped off the water with enough force to steal your breath. I arrived 30 minutes early, parking the station wagon behind a grove of wind-twisted pines. I wanted to control the environment. I wanted Lauren to feel the full weight of her isolation when she arrived. I stood near the edge of the stone cliff, pulling the collar of my wool coat up against the bitter chill. The beam of the lighthouse cut through the gathering twilight, sweeping across the dark, crashing waves. My father used to bring me here when I was young. He told me that lighthouses were not built to stop storms, they were built to guide ships through them. I was standing in the middle of a Category 5 hurricane, but for the first time in weeks, I could see the shoreline. A silver sedan turned onto the gravel access road, its headlights carving through the gloom. The car rolled to a slow, cautious stop, a few dozen yards from my vehicle. The driver's side door opened, and Lauren stepped out. She did not look like the confident junior agent who had admired my crown molding. The cream-colored trench coat was gone, replaced by a bulky, dark puffer jacket. Her hair was pulled into a messy knot, and her posture was slumped, defensive. The wind immediately battered her, making her stumble slightly on the uneven rocks. I did not move toward her. I stood perfectly still, letting her close the distance. As she approached, the ambient light from the lighthouse beam caught her face. Her eyes were red-rimmed, swollen from hours of crying. The pristine makeup was gone, revealing a pale, terrified young woman who realized she had swum out much too far into deep water. "Stephanie," she said, her voice shaking violently against the roar of the ocean. Thank you for coming. I kept my hands shoved deep inside my coat pockets, my expression carefully neutral. You have 5 minutes, Lauren. Speak. She swallowed hard, her shoulders trembling. I did not know about the country club money, I swear to you. Derek told me his business was just experiencing a temporary cash flow issue. He said the holding company was a standard legal maneuver to protect assets during a high-net-worth divorce. And the backdated postnuptial agreement I asked, my voice cutting through the wind like a serrated blade. Was that a standard legal maneuver too? Lauren's face crumpled. The tears she had been fighting spilled over her freezing cheeks. No, that was Patricia. She pressured him into it. She said if he did not secure the Tahoe money, the country club rumors would destroy their family. Derek panicked. He brought the documents to the office after hours and begged me to stamp them. He said he would take care of me. She let out a harsh, broken sob, wrapping her arms around her chest. And now he is going to hand me to a federal prosecutor. He drafted an affidavit, Stephanie. He is going to say I went rogue. He is going to let me go to prison. I stared at her, the crash of the waves filling the silence between us. A few weeks ago, standing on my freezing porch after being locked out of my own home, I would have savored this moment. I would have enjoyed watching the woman who stole my husband weep in the cold. But looking at her now, shivering and terrified, I felt a strange, quiet pity. Patricia had played her perfectly. The matriarch knew exactly what she was doing when she encouraged Derek to throw Lauren under the bus. Patricia recognized that Lauren was ambitious but naive, an outsider desperate for validation and wealth. She was the perfect pawn, easily manipulated and ultimately entirely disposable. Lauren thought she was playing the game, but she was just the board they were playing on. I do not want an apology, Lauren, I said, my tone flat, devoid of any warmth. I want the evidence you promised. On the voicemail, Lauren frantically unzipped her jacket, pulling a small silver flash drive from an interior pocket. She held it out, her hand shaking so badly the metal caught the lighthouse beam in erratic flashes. It is all here, she pleaded. The encrypted emails between Patricia and Derek orchestrating the fake LLC, the timestamps proving he directed the backdated notary stamp, the internal memos from the brokerage trying to hide the transfer from the state auditors, every single digital footprint connecting them to the fraud. I did not reach for the drive. I let her hold it out, suspended in the freezing air. What do you want for it? I asked. Lauren dropped her gaze, staring at the rocky ground. I want you to leave my name out of the civil countersuit. I want your lawyer to focus the liability entirely on Derek and Patricia. If they take the fall for the civil damages, maybe the federal prosecutor will offer me a plea deal for cooperation instead of a maximum sentence. She was bargaining for scraps, trying to salvage a few years of her life. I reached out and took the silver drive from her trembling fingers, dropping it into my coat pocket next to my father's compass. I will not name you as a primary defendant in the civil suit, I stated, my voice firm, an absolute condition. But I am not your lawyer, Lauren. When the federal authorities come knocking, and they will come knocking, you are on your own. She let out a long, shuddering breath, nodding in submission. I understand. I turned my back on her, walking away toward the station wagon. The transaction was complete. I had the murder weapon, and she had a temporary stay of execution. I drove straight back to downtown Portland, the encrypted flash drive burning a hole in my pocket. Jonathan was waiting for me in his office, the heavy mahogany desk cleared of all other case files. I placed the small silver rectangle onto the polished wood. The anchor knot is cut, I announced, taking a seat across from him. We have the emails. We have the timestamps. We have direct confirmation that Patricia orchestrated the entire conspiracy. Jonathan plugged the drive into his secure terminal, his gray eyes scanning the data as it loaded onto the screen. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. This is not just a civil victory, Stephanie. This is a criminal indictment wrapped in a bow. How do we deploy it? I asked, leaning forward. We do not, Jonathan replied, turning the monitor toward me. We wait for him to deploy it for us. I frowned, confused by the strategy. What do you mean? Jonathan tapped a legal notification that had just popped up in his inbox. Derek is desperate. The bridge loans are likely defaulting this week. He cannot wait for the California courts to untangle the postnuptial injunction. So he just escalated. Jonathan clicked the notification, opening a formal court summons. 10 minutes ago, Derek's new attorney filed an aggressive emergency motion in the Portland Superior Court. He is demanding a judge order the immediate forced sale of the Lake Tahoe mansion, citing catastrophic marital financial distress. My pulse quickened. He is bringing the fight here, to Maine. Yes, Jonathan. Confirmed, his eyes flashing with tactical anticipation. He wants a judge to compel you to liquidate the asset immediately, to cover the supposed marital debts. He is walking right into a courtroom blind, demanding a payout based on a forged document, while we are sitting on a mountain of digital evidence proving he committed felony fraud. He is setting the stage for his own execution. I whispered the magnitude of his mistake washing over me. Jonathan closed his laptop, folding his hands over the lid. We have a hearing scheduled for Friday morning. We let him present his forged post-nup. We let him demand the money, and then we detonate the bomb. I left the law firm and drove back to the wildlife center. The power was humming, the critical care tanks were warm, and the animals were safe. The storm that had battered my life for the past month was finally breaking. Derek thought he was a mastermind orchestrating a flawless heist. Patricia thought she was an untouchable queen, moving pieces across a chessboard. They were about to learn a brutal lesson about the consequences of underestimating a wounded animal. Friday morning was approaching rapidly, and the courtroom was going to be a bloodbath. Friday morning arrived with a biting frost that coated the tall arched windows of the Cumberland County Courthouse. The courtroom itself felt like a relic from another century, smelling of lemon polish, ancient steam radiators, and decades of anxious sweat. I sat at the defense table wearing a structured charcoal blazer, my posture perfectly straight. Next to me, Jonathan Reed exuded the calm stillness of a veteran general surveying a battlefield he had already conquered. Across the center aisle, Derek sat beside his newly retained counsel, a frantic-looking local attorney named Mr. Caldwell. Derek was vibrating with nervous energy. He kept adjusting his silk tie, his fingers tapping an erratic rhythm against the heavy wooden table. He needed this victory. Today, his bridge loans were reaching their absolute limit, and the private equity firm in Boston was undoubtedly breathing down his neck. He looked less like a polished real estate broker and more like a man standing on the gallows, waiting for the trap door to open. In the gallery just behind the wooden partition sat Patricia. She wore a pristine camel-colored wool coat, and draped elegantly around her neck was my mother's vintage pearl necklace. She sat with her chin tilted upward, projecting an aura of untouchable, aristocratic confidence. She was ready to watch the judge force me to liquidate my father's estate, handing her son the ultimate financial bailout. Judge Alvarez, a stern woman with sharp eyes and zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics, called the session to order. The heavy thud of her gavel echoed through the high-ceilinged room, cutting through the ambient hum of rustling papers. Mr. Caldwell immediately took the floor. He launched into a rapid, impassioned argument detailing the supposed catastrophic financial distress of the marriage. He painted Derek as a hard-working husband who was being unfairly financially starved by a vindictive, newly wealthy spouse. Your Honor, my client is facing severe economic hardship, Mr. Caldwell stated, projecting his voice across the room. We have submitted a legally binding postnuptial agreement signed by the respondent, which clearly stipulates an equal division of all inherited assets. Given the urgent nature of my client's financial obligations, we are requesting an emergency order compelling the immediate sale of the Lake Tahoe property to satisfy these marital debts. Caldwell returned to his seat, looking incredibly satisfied with his aggressive opening maneuver. Derek let out a long, shaky breath, nodding in agreement. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought the forged document was an ironclad weapon. Judge Alvarez adjusted her reading glasses, looking over the submitted motion. She then turned her sharp gaze toward our table. "Mr. Reed," she prompted, her tone expectant. "Do you have a response to this emergency motion?" Jonathan stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a slow, deliberate motion. He did not look angry. He did not look intimidated. He looked almost bored. "We do, Your Honor," Jonathan replied, his voice carrying a resonant, effortless authority. "We ask that the petitioner's motion be dismissed in its entirety. Not only is the motion frivolous, but the asset in question is no longer under the legal jurisdiction of this divorce proceeding." Mr. Caldwell shot out of his chair. "Objection, Your Honor. The deed to the Lake Tahoe property was transferred directly into the respondent's name upon her father's death. It is unequivocally subject to the marital estate under the provided postnuptial agreement." Jonathan did not even glance at the opposing lawyer. He simply reached into his leather briefcase and extracted a thick, bound legal folio bearing the embossed seal of my late father's estate trust. He approached the bench and handed the original document to the court clerk, who passed it up to the judge. "My client did indeed inherit the property, Your Honor," Jonathan explained, pacing slowly back to our table. "However, her late father was a man of extraordinary foresight. He anticipated that sudden wealth might attract sudden predators. Therefore, he did not leave the Lake Tahoe estate to his daughter as a simple direct transfer. He placed the deed inside a generation-skipping protective trust, governed by a highly specific contingency clause located on page 42. I kept my eyes locked on Derek. The erratic tapping of his fingers had stopped. His posture stiffened, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing his pale features. Judge Alvarez flipped through the heavy folio, turning to the specified page. She read the clause silently, the courtroom falling into a suffocating, breathless hush. "For the record, Your Honor," Jonathan continued, his voice slicing through the quiet room, "we refer to this legal mechanism as a poison pill. The clause explicitly states that if the primary beneficiary enters into contested divorce litigation within 6 months of the grantor's death, her status as the beneficiary is automatically and irrevocably revoked." Mr. Caldwell's jaw dropped. He scrambled to his feet, leaning over the table. "Revoked? That is impossible. Where does the asset go?" "If the poison pill is triggered," Jonathan answered, a cold, triumphant smile finally touching his lips, "the entire estate automatically defaults into an untouchable charitable foundation dedicated to coastal wildlife conservation. It is completely shielded from any marital claims, any creditors, and any postnuptial agreements, regardless of their validity." Derek sprang from his chair, gripping the edge of the wooden table so hard, his knuckles turned white. "What is he talking about?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "You cannot just give away $6 million to a bird sanctuary. I have a signed contract." Mr. Caldwell snatched a copy of the trust document from the clerk scanning the dense legal text. His eyes darted frantically across the page, reading the ironclad stipulations my father had engineered from beyond the grave. My father knew exactly what kind of man I had married. He knew Derek was driven by appearances and greed. He knew that if I was ever threatened, Derek would lack the patience to play a long game. All I had to do was run out the clock. If Derek had simply waited 6 months before filing his ambush divorce, the Tahoe money would have been vulnerable. But his hidden debts were crushing him. The private equity lenders in Boston forced his hand. By rushing the divorce, by filing the aggressive emergency motion today to force the sale, Derek had officially initiated contested litigation prior to the 6-month deadline. He pulled the trigger on the poison pill himself. Your Honor, this is a deliberate evasion of marital debt, Mr. Caldwell stammered, trying to mount a defense. It is a standard protective trust counselor, Judge Alvarez interrupted, her tone dripping with finality. And it appears your client just triggered the default clause by filing this very motion. The asset no longer belongs to Mrs. Hudson, therefore it cannot be liquidated to satisfy your client's liabilities. The motion to compel the sale is denied. Mr. Caldwell stared at the judge, the reality of the situation washing over him. He had just walked his client into a fatal legal trap. The lawyer slowly lowered his hand, the silver pen slipping from his fingers. It hit the wooden table with a sharp, hollow clatter that echoed through the silent courtroom. Derek stood frozen. His mind was racing, trying to process the catastrophic failure of his master plan. The Tahoe money was gone. The $3 million payout he had promised his bridge loan lenders was evaporating into thin air. The $5 million he embezzled from the country club was going to be discovered. The polished, charismatic broker facade cracked and then shattered entirely. Derek let out a guttural, enraged scream. He slammed both fists onto the defense table, sending legal pads and water pitchers crashing to the floor. "You set me up!" he roared, pointing a trembling finger across the aisle at me. His face was flushed a deep mottled crimson, the veins in his neck bulging against his collar. "You knew about this clause. You dragged out the mediation. You let me borrow against the settlement. You ruined me." "Order in this court," Judge Alvarez barked, striking her gavel repeatedly against the sounding block. "Mr. Caldwell, control your client immediately, or I will have him held in contempt." But Derek was beyond control. The primal terror of his impending ruin had hijacked his nervous system. He paced wildly behind his table, shouting obscenities, tearing at his expensive silk tie until it hung in ruined shreds around his neck. He blamed me. He blamed his lawyer. He ranted about the Boston lenders coming to break his legs. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting calmly in my lap. I did not flinch. I did not look away. I watched the man who had locked me out in the freezing rain drown in the consequences of his own boundless greed. In the gallery behind him, the illusion of high society elegance was collapsing just as violently. Patricia was on her feet, her pristine camel coat slipping from her shoulders. Her hands were clamped over her mouth, her eyes wide with unadulterated horror. She was watching her golden child, her perfect, successful son, unravel into a hysterical, raving lunatic in front of the public record. She knew the country club members would hear about this breakdown before the lunch hour was over. She knew the whispers would start. And she knew without the Tahoe money, there was nothing left to shield them from the devastating truth of the embezzlement. Bailiff Judge Alvarez commanded, her patience entirely exhausted. "Remove the petitioner from my courtroom." 2 armed court officers stepped forward, grabbing Derek by the arms. He fought them, twisting and thrashing, shouting my name as they dragged him backward down the center aisle. Patricia shrank back into the wooden pew, shrinking away from the chaotic, humiliating spectacle. As the heavy oak doors swung shut behind my screaming husband, cutting off his frantic voice, the courtroom descended into a heavy, stunned silence. Judge Alvarez took a deep breath, adjusting her robes. She looked down at Jonathan, her expression severe, but laced with a newfound curiosity. "Well, Mr. Reed," the judge said, her voice echoing in the quiet space. "Since the emergency motion is denied, how would you like to proceed with the remaining items on the docket?" Jonathan stood up, smoothing the lapels of his suit jacket. He reached into his briefcase, pulling out the silver flash drive I had acquired from Lauren at the lighthouse. "Your Honor," Jonathan said, his voice cool and lethal. We would like to introduce new evidence regarding the fraudulent transfer of my client's primary residence. Evidence that includes coordinated perjury, backdated notary stamps, and a conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The poison pill had destroyed Derek's future. Now it was time for the forensic evidence to bury whatever was left of his past. The heavy oak doors had barely swung shut behind my screaming husband when Judge Alvarez took a deep breath, smoothing the front of her black robes. The echoes of his frantic voice faded into the high, vaulted ceiling. The courtroom felt hollow, ringing with the aftermath of his breakdown. The judge turned her sharp gaze back to our table, her expression hardening into a mask of pure judicial authority. "Well, Mr. Reed," she prompted, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. "You mentioned new evidence regarding the fraudulent transfer of the primary residence. Let us hear it." Jonathan stood tall, his demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. He approached the bench, handing the clerk a printed dossier alongside the silver flash drive I had obtained at the lighthouse. "Your Honor, the documents in that binder trace a direct line of conspiracy," Jonathan began, his tone even and methodical. 2 weeks ago, my client's marital home in Portland was transferred into a blind holding company. The deed was signed and notarized without my client's knowledge or consent. Judge Alvarez flipped open the binder, her eyes scanning the top page. "I see a state notary seal here," she noted. "Are you alleging forgery, Counselor?" "I am alleging far more than forgery," Your Honor, Jonathan replied. "We utilized a forensic document examiner. The stamp belongs to a junior title agent named Lauren, who works directly under the petitioner. However, she used her current renewal stamp on a contract dated 3 years ago. Furthermore, the flash drive contains encrypted emails explicitly detailing the orchestration of this fake holding company." Jonathan turned slightly, gesturing toward the gallery where Patricia sat rigid in the wooden pew. "Those emails trace the funding of the holding company directly to the personal bank accounts of Patricia Hudson Jonathan," stated his voice, carrying to every corner of the room. The petitioner's mother did not just facilitate this theft, she bankrolled it. She provided the capital to illegally purchase the stolen property, masking the transaction through a shell corporation to bypass the marital estate. The color drained entirely from Patricia's face. She gripped the edge of the wooden bench in front of her, the pristine camel coat slipping further down her arms. She had walked into this courthouse, expecting to watch me lose everything. Now she was listening to a high-profile attorney read her own criminal blueprint onto the public record. Judge Alvarez adjusted her glasses, reading through the transcribed emails. The silence in the room stretched taut, holding a collective breath. The judge looked up, her eyes narrowing as she absorbed the sheer scale of the deceit. "These emails explicitly discuss backdating legal documents," Judge Alvarez said, her tone dropping to a dangerous whisper. "They outline a coordinated effort to defraud a spouse out of a primary residence using an employee to commit perjury." "Yes, Your Honor," Jonathan confirmed. "They committed real estate fraud, crossing state lines to secure funds, while simultaneously committing perjury in this very jurisdiction." Judge Alvarez did not hesitate. She picked up her pen, her hand moving decisively across the legal pad. "Based on the forensic evidence and the corresponding digital communications, the sale of the Portland property is hereby ruled entirely void," Judge Alvarez declared, her voice echoing with absolute finality. "The deed is immediately reverted to the sole possession of the respondent, Stephanie Hudson. The petitioner forfeits any equitable claim to the property due to his participation in this criminal enterprise." I let out a slow, steady breath. My home was mine again. The sanctuary I had built, the walls smelling of pine and sea salt, were returned to me with a single stroke of a pen. But Jonathan was not finished. He remained standing at the center podium, his posture radiating an unrelenting tactical focus. "We have one final matter regarding the concealment of marital assets, Your Honor," Jonathan continued. The judge looked up, raising an eyebrow. Proceed. Jonathan withdrew a single sheet of paper from his briefcase. It was the certified insurance appraisal I had requested from my broker. He handed it to the clerk, who passed it up to the bench. When my client was illegally locked out of her home, the petitioner and his accomplices did not just steal real estate, Jonathan explained. They looted the contents of the house. That document is a certified insurance appraisal for a vintage pearl necklace possessing a highly distinct, custom gold laurel wreath clasp. It is a family heirloom belonging to my client's late mother. Jonathan turned slowly, pivoting on his heel until he was facing the gallery. He raised his hand, pointing a single steady finger directly at Patricia. That stolen necklace is currently resting around the neck of the woman sitting in the second row, Jonathan announced, his voice ringing with undeniable authority. Every head in the courtroom whipped around to look at Patricia. The matriarch froze, like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming truck. Her manicured hand flew up instinctively, clutching the pearls against her throat. The custom gold clasp glinted under the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom. The sheer audacity of wearing stolen jewelry to a legal hearing was laid bare for the entire room to witness. Judge Alvarez leaned over the bench, her eyes locking onto the glowing pearls. Her expression shifted from professional severe to a cold, simmering outrage. "Are you telling me, counselor," the judge asked, her voice deathly quiet, "that this woman walked into my courtroom wearing stolen marital property while simultaneously funding a fraudulent shell corporation to steal the respondent's house?" "That is exactly what I am telling you," Your Honor, Jonathan confirmed. Given her active participation in hiding stolen assets and funding a criminal enterprise, we are requesting an immediate freeze on all personal and business bank accounts associated with Patricia Hudson, pending a full federal investigation. Patricia gasped the sound, loud and ragged in the quiet space. The implications of an asset freeze were catastrophic for a woman whose entire identity relied on wealth. Her credit cards would bounce. Her country club dues would go unpaid. She would be locked out of her own fortune before she even reached the courthouse parking lot. "Motion granted," Judge Alvarez snapped, striking her gavel with a sharp, violent crack. "I am issuing an immediate freeze on all assets tied to the holding company and its primary investors. I am also forwarding this entire docket, the encrypted emails, the forensic reports, and the transcript of today's proceedings, directly to the District Attorney's Office for criminal prosecution." The reality of the situation crashed down on Patricia with the force of a collapsing building. The untouchable society queen, the woman who had smirked at me on my freezing porch, was suddenly facing a frozen bank account and a criminal indictment. The high society she worshipped would read about this before sunset. Panic is a vicious mirror. It strips away the polished veneer and reveals the true nature of a person. Patricia did not possess loyalty. She only possessed self-preservation. She leaped to her feet, her designer handbag spilling onto the floor. "It was Derek," she screamed, her voice shrill and hysterical, echoing off the high ceiling. The entire courtroom stared at her in stunned silence. "I did not orchestrate anything," Patricia cried, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at the empty doors where her son had just been dragged through. "He manipulated me. He told me the house was legally his. He told me the girl notarized it willingly. He stole my money to fund that company. He lied to me to cover his own debts." She was throwing her own son to the wolves, trying to build a raft out of his sinking ship. The woman who had proudly commanded yacht club galas was now sobbing in a public gallery, begging a judge to arrest her child instead of her. It was a pathetic, undignified display of pure cowardice. "Bailiff, escort that woman out of my courtroom," Judge Alvarez ordered, her tone laced with profound disgust, "and confiscate that necklace on her way out. It belongs in an evidence locker until it is returned to the rightful owner." A uniformed officer approached the pew, demanding Patricia hand over the heirloom. Her hands shook violently as she unclasped the custom gold wreath, dropping the pearls into a plastic evidence bag. She was escorted down the center aisle, weeping, her flawless reputation burning to ash with every step she took toward the exit. I sat at the defense table, bathed in the quiet aftermath of the destruction. I did not smile. I did not cheer. The justice unfolding around me was absolute, but it did not require my applause. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my father's solid brass compass. I set it gently onto the heavy wooden table in front of me. The needle spun for a brief moment, navigating the magnetic pull of the room, before settling into a perfect, unwavering line. It pointed directly at the empty chair across the aisle, the chair where my husband had sat just 30 minutes prior, believing he held all the power in the world. The trap had sprung. The anchor knot was severed. They had built a beautiful, elaborate house of cards out of greed and hubris. All I had to do was open the window and let the storm blow it down. I sat perfectly relaxed, watching the dust settle, knowing the real-world consequences were waiting for them, just outside those heavy oak doors. The weekend following the courtroom ruling brought a strange quiet to the coast. I stood inside the marine transport bay of the wildlife sanctuary, holding a clipboard and listening to the rhythmic hum of the water filtration systems. The air smelled of kelp and cold salt water. Megan stood beside me, her shoulders relaxed for the first time in a month. The bank holding the commercial loans had received the official court transcripts on Monday morning. Because the notary stamp was forensically proven to be a forgery, the debt tied to my sanctuary was instantly nullified. The crushing weight of the impending foreclosure evaporated. The animals were safe. The enclosures would stay warm. My father's compass had pointed true, and the storm had finally broken over our heads. But while the skies above my life were clearing, a Category 5 hurricane was making landfall on the other side of town. Derek had relied entirely on the Lake Tahoe inheritance to satisfy the unregulated lenders in Boston. When Judge Alvarez triggered the poison pill and froze his remaining assets, that financial lifeline vanished. The bridge loans reached their maturity date at 5 o'clock on Monday evening. Derek did not have the capital to pay the exorbitant interest, let alone the principal balance. He defaulted. And when a desperate man defaults on unregulated debt, the creditors do not send polite letters. They strip the carcass bare. The resulting financial collapse acted like a flare shot into the night sky, illuminating every shadow in his ledger. The federal investigators and the local district attorney opened the frozen accounts, poring over the transactional data. What they found was not just a few missed payments. They found the hollowed-out retirement accounts of the wealthiest citizens in Maine. The story broke on a Tuesday morning. The local newspaper ran the headline across the front page in bold black ink. Prominent real estate broker indicted in multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme. The article detailed the entire fraudulent operation, mapping out exactly how Derek had lured the coastal elite into a fake high-yield development fund. The journalist named the country club victims, tracing their stolen pensions straight into Derek's gambling debts and personal expenses. The blast radius of that publication was spectacular. Patricia was having breakfast on the veranda of her sprawling New England estate when the paper was delivered. For weeks, she had paraded around the Casco Bay Yacht Club, whispering vicious rumors about my mental health. She had painted me as a greedy villain to protect her son's pristine image. Now the people she worshipped, the friends she had tried to impress her entire life, were reading about how her golden child had robbed them blind. The realization must have been a physical blow. Patricia had funded the fake holding company to help Derek steal my house. The authorities had frozen her bank accounts, linking her directly to the conspiracy. Her high society friends did not just see a mother protecting a son. They saw a willing accomplice. They realized Patricia was funding a criminal enterprise using the very money Derek had stolen from their retirement funds. The retaliation was instantaneous and brutal. Patricia's cell phone stopped ringing. The exclusive invitations to the charity galas and summer clam bakes were rescinded without explanation. When she attempted to enter the yacht club dining room that afternoon, the maitre d' blocked her path. He quietly informed her that her membership had been revoked by a unanimous vote of the board of directors. The wealthy patrons sitting at the white cloth tables turned their backs to her, refusing to make eye contact. The clinking of silverware stopped. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the dining room. The elite society she had spent decades cultivating turned on her with the ruthless efficiency of a wolf pack culling a diseased member. She was exiled. She became a total social pariah, isolated in a mansion she could no longer afford to maintain. The smear campaign she had launched against me acted as a boomerang, returning to sever her own standing in the community. Patricia walked out of the yacht club, her pristine camel coat, offering no protection against the chilling reality of her new existence. She was nobody. While Patricia was being escorted out of her social circle, Derek was experiencing his own professional execution. He drove his sleek, black luxury vehicle to his downtown brokerage, hoping to salvage some fragment of his career. He thought he could spin the narrative blaming a rogue accountant or a misunderstanding in the tax code. He parked in his reserved spot and walked up to the heavy glass doors of the firm. He swiped his secure access card against the digital reader. The light blinked red. The doors remained locked. He swiped the card again, a knot of panic forming in his chest. A security guard he had known for 5 years stepped out from the lobby, holding a single cardboard box. The guard unlocked the door, handing the box to Derek. Inside were a few personal photographs, a desk calendar, and a decorative paperweight. Nothing else. Derek's partners had read the morning headlines. A real estate firm survives on trust and reputation. A broker who embezzles from his own clients is a cancer that must be excised immediately. The board of directors had convened an emergency meeting before sunrise, voting unanimously to terminate his partnership and strip his name from the corporate letterhead. They severed all ties, issuing a public statement condemning his actions and pledging full cooperation with the federal authorities. Derek stood on the cold sidewalk, holding his cardboard box, staring at the building he had helped build. The icy wind bit at his face. He was locked out, isolated, and utterly ruined. The tailored suits and the charismatic smile could no longer hide the reality of his existence. He was a fraud, and the entire world now knew it. His cell phone buzzed incessantly in his pocket, displaying unknown numbers from the Boston area code. The unregulated lenders were hunting him, and he had nowhere left to hide. I sat in my office at the Wildlife Center, drinking a cup of hot black coffee. The local news station was playing softly on the small television in the corner, broadcasting the details of the scandal. I watched the reporters stand outside Derek's former brokerage, recounting the staggering sums of stolen money. I felt a profound sense of calm. The legal victory Jonathan and I had secured in the courtroom was ironclad. The deeds were corrected, the fake loans were erased, and the truth was inscribed into the public record. But a legal ruling is just ink on paper. The true justice was unfolding in the real world, where the consequences of their boundless greed were finally coming to collect. Derek and Patricia had built an empire on lies, manipulation, and stolen wealth. They had pushed me out into the freezing rain, expecting me to freeze to death quietly. Instead, they had given me the clarity to see the deep structural flaws in their fortress. I had simply stepped aside and let the weight of their own arrogance pull the foundation down around them. The townsfolk who had whispered behind my back at the grocery store now looked at me with profound respect. The corporate sponsors who had pulled their funding from my charity called my office begging to reinstate their grants, offering public apologies for doubting my character. My reputation emerged from the fire tempered and unbreakable. But the collapse of the Hudson family was not quite finished. Being a social outcast and an unemployed broker were merely the prelude to the ultimate reckoning. The banks and the federal prosecutors were not interested in apologies or explanations. They were interested in restitution and prison time. The predators who had tried to leave me homeless were about to find out exactly what it felt like to have the ground pulled out from under their own feet. The final hammer was suspended in the air, and gravity was about to take over. The wheels of federal justice grind slowly, but they grind exceptionally fine. 3 weeks after the dramatic courtroom ruling, a fleet of dark sedans pulled into the driveway of the modest townhouse Derek was renting. The local police did not handle the arrest. Agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation stepped out of the vehicles, wearing dark windbreakers bearing bright yellow lettering. They knocked on his door right as the morning commuters drove past. Derek was escorted out in handcuffs. He looked pale, diminished, a hollow shell of the polished broker who used to command boardrooms. The indictment included 24 counts of wire fraud, securities fraud, and embezzlement. The judge denied bail, citing him as a severe flight risk due to his outstanding debts to unregulated lenders. He traded his tailored suits for an orange jumpsuit, waiting in a concrete cell for a trial that would undoubtedly end in a lengthy federal prison sentence. His high-priced attorneys were gone, replaced by an overworked public defender who advised him to plead guilty and hope for leniency. There would be no leniency for a man who stole from the elderly. Lauren did not stay to watch the fallout. The state licensing board revoked her notary commission permanently. A federal prosecutor offered her a harsh plea deal in exchange for her testimony against Derek and Patricia. She avoided prison, but her professional reputation was scorched earth. No title agency or law firm in the country would hire someone convicted of participating in real estate fraud. She packed her designer bags into her silver sedan and drove out of Maine under the cover of darkness. She left behind the stolen house and the dreams of high society, moving back to a small apartment in a distant state where nobody knew her name. She became a ghost, haunted by the ghost of her own unchecked ambition. She traded a life of luxury for a minimum wage job in a dusty retail store, constantly looking over her shoulder. The federal prosecutors needed to recover the millions stolen from the country club retirees. Since Derek had squandered the capital on gambling and failing developments, the government turned to his co-conspirator. Patricia had bankrolled the fake holding company, intertwining her personal finances with her son's criminal enterprise. The district attorney seized her frozen accounts, transferring the funds directly to the victim's restitution trust. But liquid cash was not enough to cover the staggering deficit. The banks filed a series of rapid liens against her most prized possession, her sprawling generational New England estate. The foreclosure was swift and unforgiving. On a crisp Tuesday morning, 2 county sheriffs arrived at the wrought iron gates of the property. Patricia stood in the grand foyer, clutching a single leather handbag. The woman who had proudly smirked on my porch telling me I was homeless by the weekend now faced the exact same fate. She wore a simple gray coat, stripped of her vintage pearls and her arrogant posture. The sheriffs escorted her down the long paved driveway, past the pristine manicured lawns and the meticulously pruned rose bushes. A local news crew filmed the eviction from the sidewalk, broadcasting her humiliating departure to the very society that had already exiled her. She climbed into the back of a waiting taxi, casting one final devastated look at the mansion she would never enter again. She was moving into a cramped studio apartment on the other side of the county, stripped of her wealth, her status, and her pride. The bank listed the estate at a public auction, intending to liquidate the property to satisfy the remaining restitution orders. The auction was held on the front steps of the county courthouse. Jonathan Reed attended on my behalf, standing quietly among the local developers and real estate investors. When the auctioneer opened the bidding, Jonathan raised his numbered paddle. He did not represent me personally. He represented the newly formed Lake Tahoe Coastal Conservation Trust. The poison pill my father engineered had blossomed into a fully funded charitable foundation endowed with $6 million. Jonathan outbid every developer in the crowd, securing the winning bid with a single cashier check. The grand estate, the ultimate symbol of elitist exclusion, now belonged to a wildlife sanctuary. The transformation of the property was a masterpiece of poetic justice. We spent the next 3 months renovating the grounds. The sprawling, pristine lawns where Patricia used to host high tea were excavated to build deep saltwater rehabilitation pools for injured marine life. The pristine rose gardens were replaced with native coastal grasses and nesting enclosures for migratory birds. The quiet, refined atmosphere was replaced by the chaotic, beautiful noise of barking seals, squawking pelicans, and the hum of industrial water pumps. Mud tracked across the paved walkways, replacing the spotless cobblestones. The grand ballroom was converted into a state-of-the-art veterinary clinic, featuring stainless steel surgical tables and diagnostic imaging machines. The crystal chandeliers were carefully removed and sold, funding a brand new transport vehicle for rescuing stranded animals. The formal dining room, where Patricia used to host exclusive dinner parties, was turned into a staff break room, smelling of strong coffee and antiseptic wipes. The estate became a thriving, loud, messy sanctuary dedicated to healing the broken and the vulnerable. We hired more staff, expanding our operation to cover the entire northern coastline. The very walls that once housed arrogance and deceit were now soaked in purpose and compassion. I drove up the gravel driveway one afternoon, parking my old station wagon near the new triage center. The air smelled of fish brine and wet earth, a stark contrast to the expensive perfumes that once haunted these halls. I stepped out of the car, watching my veterinary technicians carry crates of medical supplies through the grand double doors. A harbor seal splashed in the newly constructed pool, sending a spray of salt water across the former patio. I did not feel a sudden rush of vindictive glee. I did not spend my days gloating over the destruction of the Hudson family. I felt a profound, quiet indifference. They had weaponized their greed trying to crush me into the dirt. But dirt is where seeds take root. They buried themselves in their own traps, while I simply focused on the sunlight. The villains had been dismantled by the very avarice they worshipped. Derek was sitting in a federal penitentiary, contemplating a decade behind bars. Patricia was living in obscurity, entirely forgotten by the friends she sacrificed everything to impress. Lauren was erasing her past in a town that did not care who she used to be. They had chased wealth and status with such relentless hunger that they ended up devouring themselves. I walked toward the main entrance, the coastal breeze tugging at my hair. I felt a deep, grounding peace settling into my bones. The frantic adrenaline of the past few months had washed away, leaving behind a clear, unclouded vision of the future. I had reclaimed my dignity, my legacy, and my freedom. The storm had passed, and the soil was ready for something new to grow. The universe has a strange way of balancing the scales, ensuring that those who attempt to leave others out in the cold eventually find themselves shivering in the dark. 6 months had passed since the gavel fell in Judge Alvarez's courtroom, and the brutal Maine winter had finally yielded to a breathtaking spring. The ice melted from the jagged coastline, giving way to a brilliant, sparkling blue ocean. The pine forests surrounding Portland woke from their frozen slumber, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and fresh cedar needles. The dust had settled completely, leaving behind a landscape irrevocably changed. The Hudson family, once a dominant force in coastal society, had been entirely erased. Derek was currently navigating the realities of a federal penitentiary in a neighboring state, his 10-year sentence offering plenty of time to reflect on the cost of unchecked greed. Patricia remained a ghost, living in a small apartment far from the yacht club she had once ruled. A cautionary tale, whispered about at high society dinners. Lauren had vanished, a casualty of her own ambition, working an hourly job under a different name. As for me, I didn't just survive the storm. I thrived in its aftermath. My first act of closure had been selling the marital home in Portland. The house held too many memories of betrayal, the walls echoing with the final arguments and the terrifying realization of the lockout. I sold it to a nice young couple relocating from the Midwest, taking comfort in the fact that the space would be filled with new, uncorrupted memories. I didn't need the house anyway, because I had found exactly where I belonged. Using a fraction of the dividends generated by the Tahoe Protective Trust, I purchased a stunning, isolated cabin deep in the dense Maine pine forests. The property sat on a high rocky bluff overlooking a private cove miles away from the manicured lawns and judgmental whispers of high society. The cabin was built of solid timber and stone, with massive windows that offered an unobstructed view of the crashing Atlantic. It smelled of wood smoke, old books, and the undeniable scent of freedom. The Lake Tahoe Coastal Conservation Trust had become a dominant force in environmental protection along the Northeast Corridor. The newly renovated estate, once Patricia's pride and joy, was now a bustling, thriving sanctuary. The deep saltwater rehabilitation pools were constantly occupied by recovering marine life, the air filled with the chaotic, joyful noise of healing. My professional life was demanding but deeply fulfilling. I had expanded our operations, launching a secondary facility further up the coast to handle the overflow of migratory birds. The corporate sponsors who had momentarily doubted my character during Patricia's smear campaign had returned in full force, doubling their previous contributions as a gesture of apology and respect. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, I finished my rounds at the main sanctuary, checking on a newly admitted harbor seal pup before driving back to my cabin. The drive was peaceful, the winding coastal road flanked by towering evergreens. When I walked through the heavy wooden door of the cabin, the silence that greeted me wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of a broken home. It was a warm, settling quiet. I changed out of my work clothes, slipping into a comfortable pair of jeans and a thick hand-knit sweater. I walked over to the small, locked cedar vanity resting in the corner of the bedroom. I unlocked the drawer and pulled out the velvet box containing my mother's vintage pearl necklace. The custom gold laurel wreath clasp gleamed softly in the fading afternoon light. I ran my fingers over the iridescent pearls, feeling a profound sense of connection to the woman who had worn them before me. Patricia had tried to wear them as a trophy, a symbol of conquest, but she hadn't understood their true value. They weren't just jewelry. They were a testament to resilience, to surviving storms and emerging stronger. I clasped the necklace around my neck, the pearls resting comfortably against my collarbone. I didn't wear them to impress anyone. I wore them for myself, a quiet reminder of everything I had fought to protect. I walked out to the expansive wooden deck overlooking the cove, carrying a steaming mug of black coffee. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in vibrant strokes of orange pink and deep violet. The ocean crashed against the rocky shoreline below, a rhythmic, powerful heartbeat that grounded me in the present moment. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my father's solid brass compass. I held it in the palm of my hand, watching the needle spin wildly before settling into a perfect, unwavering line pointing steadily north. My father had been right. The world will always try to turn you around, to knock you off balance with betrayal, greed, and unexpected cruelty. People like Derek and Patricia build their lives on shifting sands, relying on manipulation and deceit to maintain their fragile empires. They mistake kindness for weakness, assuming that a quiet demeanor equals submission. They didn't understand the strength required to remain silent when every instinct screams for retaliation. True revenge wasn't found in screaming matches, public confrontations, or vindictive sabotage. True revenge was a cold, calculated patience. It was the discipline to step back, to untangle the knot instead of pulling on the loose ends. It was watching the people who tried to destroy you drown in the very traps they had meticulously set. I hadn't needed to ruin Derek and Patricia. Their own boundless arrogance had done the job perfectly. I simply provided the rope and let gravity take over. I took a slow sip of my coffee, the bitter warmth a perfect contrast to the cool sea breeze. I looked out over the vast, darkening ocean, feeling a profound sense of peace settle over me. I had reclaimed my home, my dignity, and my father's legacy. I had protected the sanctuary and the innocent lives that depended on it. I had proven that a wounded animal is not helpless. It is simply waiting for the right moment to strike. The storm that had threatened to wash me away had instead cleared the horizon, leaving a pristine, unclouded view of the future. I was exactly where I was meant to be, anchored by the truth, surrounded by the wild, unforgiving beauty of the Maine coast. I lowered the compass, sliding it back into my pocket, the metal warm against my skin. I didn't need to check the coordinates anymore. I knew exactly where I was. I had weathered the hurricane. I had cut the anchor knot, and I had finally, truly, found my way home. 6 months had passed since the gavel fell in Judge Alvarez's courtroom, and the brutal Maine winter had finally yielded to a breathtaking spring. The ice melted from the jagged coastline, giving way to a brilliant, sparkling blue ocean. The pine forests surrounding Portland woke from their frozen slumber, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and fresh cedar needles. The dust had settled completely, leaving behind a landscape irrevocably changed. The Hudson family, once a dominant force in coastal society, had been entirely erased. Derek was currently navigating the realities of a federal penitentiary in a neighboring state, his 10-year sentence offering plenty of time to reflect on the cost of unchecked greed. Patricia remained a ghost, living in a small apartment far from the yacht club she had once ruled, a cautionary tale whispered about at high society dinners. Lauren had vanished, a casualty of her own ambition, working an hourly job under a different name. As for me, I didn't just survive the storm. I thrived in its aftermath. My first act of closure had been selling the marital home in Portland. The house held too many memories of betrayal, the walls echoing with the final arguments and the terrifying realization of the lockout. I sold it to a nice young couple relocating from the Midwest, taking comfort in the fact that the space would be filled with new, uncorrupted memories. I didn't need the house anyway, because I had found exactly where I belonged. Using a fraction of the dividends generated by the Tahoe Protective Trust, I purchased a stunning, isolated cabin deep in the dense Maine pine forests. The property sat on a high, rocky bluff overlooking a private cove, miles away from the manicured lawns and judgmental whispers of high society. The cabin was built of solid timber and stone, with massive windows that offered an unobstructed view of the crashing Atlantic. It smelled of wood smoke, old books, and the undeniable scent of freedom. The Lake Tahoe Coastal Conservation Trust had become a dominant force in environmental protection along the Northeast Corridor. The newly renovated estate, once Patricia's pride and joy, was now a bustling, thriving sanctuary. The deep saltwater rehabilitation pools were constantly occupied by recovering marine life, the air filled with the chaotic, joyful noise of healing. My professional life was demanding but deeply fulfilling. I had expanded our operations, launching a secondary facility further up the coast to handle the overflow of migratory birds. The corporate sponsors, who had momentarily doubted my character during Patricia's smear campaign, had returned in full force, doubling their previous contributions as a gesture of apology and respect. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, I finished my rounds at the main sanctuary, checking on a newly admitted harbor seal pup before driving back to my cabin. The drive was peaceful, the winding coastal road flanked by towering evergreens. When I walked through the heavy wooden door of the cabin, the silence that greeted me wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of a broken home. It was a warm, settling quiet. I changed out of my work clothes, slipping into a comfortable pair of jeans and a thick hand-knit sweater. I walked over to the small, locked cedar vanity resting in the corner of the bedroom. I unlocked the drawer and pulled out the velvet box containing my mother's vintage pearl necklace. The custom gold laurel wreath clasp gleamed softly in the fading afternoon light. I ran my fingers over the iridescent pearls, feeling a profound sense of connection to the woman who had worn them before me. Patricia had tried to wear them as a trophy, a symbol of conquest, but she hadn't understood their true value. They weren't just jewelry. They were a testament to resilience, to surviving storms and emerging stronger. I clasped the necklace around my neck, the pearls resting comfortably against my collarbone. I didn't wear them to impress anyone. I clasped the necklace around my neck, the pearls resting comfortably against my collarbone. I didn't wear them to impress anyone. I wore them for myself, a quiet reminder of everything I had fought to protect. I walked out to the expansive wooden deck overlooking the cove, carrying a steaming mug of black coffee. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in vibrant strokes of orange, pink, and deep violet. The ocean crashed against the rocky shoreline below, a rhythmic, powerful heartbeat that grounded me in the present moment. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my father's solid brass compass. I held it in the palm of my hand, watching the needle spin wildly before settling into a perfect, unwavering line, pointing steadily north. My father had been right. The world will always try to turn you around, to knock you off balance with betrayal, greed, and unexpected cruelty. People like Derek and Patricia build their lives on shifting sands, relying on manipulation and deceit to maintain their fragile empires. They mistake kindness for weakness, assuming that a quiet demeanor equals submission. They didn't understand the strength required to remain silent when every instinct screams for retaliation. True revenge wasn't found in screaming matches, public confrontations, or vindictive sabotage. True revenge was a cold, calculated patience. It was the discipline to step back, to untangle the knot instead of pulling on the loose ends. It was watching the people who tried to destroy you drown in the very traps they had meticulously set. I hadn't needed to ruin Derek and Patricia. Their own boundless arrogance had done the job perfectly. I simply provided the rope and let gravity take over. I took a slow sip of my coffee, the bitter warmth a perfect contrast to the cool sea breeze. I looked out over the vast, darkening ocean, feeling a profound sense of peace settle over me. I had reclaimed my home, my dignity, and my father's legacy. I had protected the sanctuary and the innocent lives that depended on it. I had proven that a wounded animal is not helpless. It is simply waiting for the right moment to strike. The storm that had threatened to wash me away had instead cleared the horizon, leaving a pristine, unclouded view of the future. I was exactly where I was meant to be, anchored by the truth, surrounded by the wild, unforgiving beauty of the Maine coast. I lowered the compass, sliding it back into my pocket, the metal warm against my skin. I didn't need to check the coordinates anymore. I knew exactly where I was. I had weathered the hurricane, I had cut the anchor knot, and I had finally, truly, found my way home.